Welcome to everybody, benvinguts at the SADE Forum in Barcelona. Welcome to those who are here and those who are following online. I hope everybody's doing well, and I want to do a brief introduction to this workshop on social movements, markets, and a common-based approach to the digital world. We are following a hybrid model, which is a bit of an experiment, which will mean that people can ask questions in the chat online, and people who are here in the room can use the microphone that we will pass around. It's a bit of an experiment into this new model that we'll see how it's going to be in this post or almost post-pandemic life. The introduction I wanted to do is about how a group of professors and researchers and PhD students here started getting interested in three themes that are the three themes that we are going to be discussing in this afternoon, and how we thought of ways to bringing these three themes together. This was first under the umbrella of a Digicom project, which is funded by the Ministry of Science and Innovation, and it involves three different topics, as I was saying. No? Then let me explain a bit what I'm referring to. The first is the role of social movements and the creation of new types of markets, and markets that are specifically involving some moral values. And there are some examples like organic food, ethical investing, or animal welfare products, etc. So this would be one of the lines of work that some of the speakers are going to talk to us about. The second theme has to do about the moral concerns that are presented by the emergence of the digital economy and the question of how this digital economy should be governed, as well as the alternatives to these moral concerns that has led to alternative forms of organizing on this digital economy, sometimes led by social movement activists, trying to incorporate or preserve some moral values into these forms of organizing or these new markets on this digital economy. And the third theme has to do with the use and adaptation of the notion of the commons as a framework to explain and to organize these alternative markets and these alternative forms of organizing. As is well known, the commons framework was first developed by the economist Elinor Ostrom to explain ways to manage forestry, fisheries, irrigation systems, and many other examples like that. But more recently, many people have used that framework or this notion and adapted it to the digital world. And some people talk about the digital commons. So we want to also explore that third theme and see how this is also used sometimes by the same social movement activists that we've been talking about in the other two themes earlier. So in short, we want to explore the interconnections between these concepts and these themes. And then for this reason, we invited some experts and some activists, we could say, that are involved in this type of initiatives to explain how they have studied this and what conclusions they have arrived to, and to open a conversation with all of us. As I said, we'll have questions online, questions face-to-face, and then we have some moderators, and pass now the floor to Joan Rodon, professor in the Department of Operations, Innovation, and Big Data, who is going to introduce to us the speakers of this first panel. I also want to thank the people who are helping us here to organize all of this, to manage the online, and the blending of the hybrid and the online goes very smoothly. So, Joan?
Thank you very much, Daniel. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this first session, which has as a title, Social Movement and Moral Markets. In this first session, we will have three speakers. We will have with us physically here in the room, Desiree Pacheco, and outside online we will have two other speakers, Panikos Georgialis, and we also have Simone Schiller-Merkens. Let me briefly introduce the three speakers, and afterwards how we organize the session. The first speaker will be Panikos Georgialis. Panikos is an assistant professor of strategy at the Amsterdam Business School in the University of Amsterdam. And Panikos' research focuses on the intersection of strategy, organizational theory, and sustainability. Panikos is going to give a presentation on the social movements and the evolution of moral markets. The second speaker will be Desire. Desire Pacheco is an associate professor of entrepreneurship at IESE, Universidad de Navarra, and her research focuses on sustainable businesses at the interface between institutions, entrepreneurship, and firm strategy. Desiree will give a presentation on social movement and entrepreneurship. And the third speaker is Simone Schiller-Merkens. Simone is a senior researcher at the Witten-Herdecke University in Germany. Her research focuses on the relationship between broader societal challenges such as moralizations or the turn towards the growth and post-capitalism, and the relationship between these broader societal challenges and the organizing of fields and organizations. Simone will give a presentation on organizing toward an alternative economy, social movement, and alternative organizing. The idea is that each presenter will take about 15 minutes to give the presentation, and at the end, we are going to have about 20-25 minutes for a debate with the audience. So I give the floor to Panikos so he can start with the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, and many thanks to the organizers, both from the program side and the technical side. I think this is, it seems to be very well organized, very ambitious to do this in a hybrid form, and I think so far the experiment is working. So let me share my screen, and you can tell me if you can see and hear it in 1 minute. So can everybody see and hear me? Okay, perfect. So let me get started then. Many thanks again to the organizers. I wanted to also say that I'm very excited to be here with two other great panelists, with Simone and Desiree, who've done great research in this area. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. What I will present today is also a hybrid in the sense that when Daniel invited me to present, he said that I could present published work or work in progress, and I decided to do a little bit of both. So I'll give you some insights from the work I've done in the past, but also a teaser on recent work or work in progress that I'm doing now, looking at the impact of social movements on moral markets and the evolution of these markets. So first things first, what we typically think of social markets, moral markets to be, how we conceptualize them, is markets whose purpose, or at least one of the primary purposes, is to create social value, addressing social or environmental problems through the market. So examples of these are market for recycling, grass-fed meat, socially responsible investing, renewable energy, fair trade goods, and so on. These are products that are typically considered to be normatively superior compared to alternative products, and because of that, they tend to be promoted by actors that are driven by moral considerations, and most of the research in this area has identified that social movements and social movement organizations have been fundamental for the development of these sectors. And some of this work, including work by Desiree, who's in this panel, shows that the involvement of social movement organizations changes the usual patterns of industry development. So these sectors develop in different ways compared to sectors that do not involve these players. Now, what are the contributions of social movements to market formation? If we split it to kind of supply side and demand side contributions, on the supply side, we can say that the diagnostic framing, so the identification, so the diagnosis of a problem prompts the search for alternative solutions to address that problem. Prognostic framing, so identifying particular solution, draws attention to those business opportunities, be it in organic or renewable or ethical fashion and so on, and induces motivation of entrepreneurs and other participants who want to be involved in these areas. And in addition, social movements, in some cases, they also act as mediators who provide information about these opportunities that leads to reduction of uncertainty and lowers the cost of search for producers who might be involved. On the demand side, the involvement of these activists, these social movements, enables the legitimacy of these markets. It can often induce changes in consumer preferences. It makes consumers more likely to adopt these products or services, and they often are involved in helping create industry infrastructure or market infrastructure, such as policy frameworks that are favorable to these markets. Now, a lot of the research on this topic, especially looking at social movements, has come from organization theorists, organizational sociologists, and has focused a lot on the market level of analysis, how social movements influence markets. Typical outcome variables that have been studied are entrepreneurial activity or entry rates or market growth. So usually the focus has been at the kind of macro level, the market level. Because of that, often this research has ignored firm heterogeneity, differences across firms in whether they enter these markets or not. At the same time, research in strategy that looks at market entry tends to focus on firm heterogeneity a lot, especially looking at resources and capabilities and how they lead companies to engage in some new markets or not, but has not paid a lot of attention to the social context of market entry decisions. So what we have is a symmetrical gap in the literature where, while we know a lot about the influence of social movements on markets overall, we know less about why some firms enter moral markets while others do not. Now, as mentioned earlier, there are a lot of things that social movements do to spearhead the development of moral markets, and some of them speak to helping identify the opportunities. Others affect actually the how attractive these opportunities are and the valuation of opportunities, eventually leading firms to enter these markets. But the identity of the organization, of the focal firm, might also affect how these influences of social movements are translated or how they're filtered. So the inducements for firms to enter moral markets or the pressures that they face depend on who they are as an organization. So why is organizational identity important? We know from prior work that identity labels or identity frames, so what people perceive the organization to be, members of the organization, but also outsider, changes their strategic direction. So some earlier research has shown that after the breakup of AT&T into regional companies, these were like essentially smaller companies that had the same culture and the same history and the same resources, but they identified themselves differently as a telecommunications company versus a multimedia company. And that led them to enter very different types of markets and go in different strategic directions. Another example comes from Patagonia, which entered a market that is seemingly unrelated with its earlier practices. This is a clothing company, but it entered the market for organic goods. And the reason is that this is consistent with the identity of the company as one that is trying to solve the environmental crisis. So what we're arguing here is that market entry depends also on the correspondence between the identity of the company and the market opportunity. So if we think about how this would play out in a conventional market, well, what we know about conventional markets is that when firms have an identity that is congruent with the market opportunity, that guides managerial attention, it filters the attention of decision makers, and makes them more likely to attend to that opportunity and potentially enter. On the other hand, when the identity is challenging to, when the market opportunity, is challenging to the identity of the company, usually they fail to see these opportunities. They don't really grasp their attention. But something different happens when we're talking about moral markets. And the reason is the involvement of social movements. Because social movements point to solutions, firms with a congruent identity will become aware of market opportunities, and maybe even more so compared to conventional markets. But the biggest difference is that diagnostic framing, so the fact that social movements also try to point to the problem and the agents that are responsible to the problem, makes it so that firms with oppositional identities also become aware of these opportunities because they become the targets of activists, or because other firms in their industry become the targets of activists. So that affects the possibility that they will identify these opportunities. It's a little bit different when we're talking about evaluating opportunities. As mentioned earlier, social movements can make markets more attractive, either by inducing demand or legitimacy, or helping create market infrastructure. And because a congruent identity is typically linked to more positive evaluations, the fact that the market is also more attractive, that will make firms with a congruent identity more likely to enter. But firms with oppositional identities, they also have something to benefit. They also benefit from increased demand and better industry infrastructure and policy frameworks and so on. But they also face some risks of being criticized as inauthentic or greenwashers when they enter these markets. So what we expect is that in moral markets, the likelihood of market entry will be stronger for firms that have a congruent identity compared to those with an oppositional identity. But still, because the ones with an oppositional identity are still going to be made aware of opportunities, they still have something to benefit, the likelihood of market entry will be stronger for them compared to those with an unrelated identity. And the bottom line here is that while we think of institutional pressures as typically leading to isomorphism, what we see in moral markets is that the presence of social movements leads to greater organizational diversity. We see firms with a congruent identity, so the good guys, let's say, coming in, but also some firms that have an oppositional identity. We see some of the Walmart going into organic, or some of the big oil companies going into renewable energy. So how does that help us understand and theorize about the evolution of moral markets? Well, let's see what might be the key elements of a theory about that. So clearly, contributions by social movement organizations are really important. If not a distinguishing feature of moral markets, they're certainly typical, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is what I argued just now, is that the presence of social movements can lead to greater diversity of the organizations, of the firms that are involved in these sectors. And that's important because having diverse firms helps provide the diverse resources that are needed to develop a market. At the same time, it also can make it difficult to establish collective identity, to coordinate between producers because they have very different motivations and very different identities, and coordinate to promote the market. So it can also create problems. Now, the fact that we have this diversity of firms being part of this industry, but also other players, including social movement organizations, is important because it also suggests that we have to think about the interdependencies between them. Doesn't matter, for example, if Greenpeace is promoting the solar sector or if it's a trade association that is doing it. Are these contributions complementary, or are they substituting for the contributions of industry? And market building, if we think about it, it requires coordination to some degree. Is it the same for an organization, again, like Greenpeace, to engage in collective action with trade associations and startups versus working together with producers from the oil business? So that can create also some tension. So at the end of the day, what may matter more is not necessarily the presence of a single group of actors, but a configuration of actors in a given context and the interdependencies between them, if they're providing similar contributions or complementary contributions to the formation of the market, to establishing market legitimacy, to getting favorable regulation, and so on. And finally, the group of players that are part of moral markets and the interdependencies between them might change over time. So early on, these markets may be populated by the committed early movers, the ones that really care about the social or environmental cause. But what happens later when the moral market matures, when different kinds of players come in, it becomes more about big business and gross margins, and it makes it difficult for firms to coordinate. So how do these actors work together to collectively promote a market over the development of a moral market? So over the past few years with my collaborators, we've been working to try to put these pieces of the puzzle together. And of course, many have written about the impact of social movements on moral markets, including some of the other panelists who have done, as I mentioned, excellent research in this area. Some of these ideas are summarized in a recent article with Brandon Lee, Strategic Organization, where we also talk about, in more detail, about how social movements lead to greater organizational diversity and under what conditions this effect is likely to appear. So what are the firm attributes and the social movement attributes that kind of establish the boundary conditions? And right now, I'm currently working with Todd Schiffeling from Temple University to put together, or we're trying to put together the last two pieces of the puzzle. And this is very early stage work, so the data work is still evolving and also the conceptualization. So I just wanted to give you some kind of brief idea of what we're thinking here, but I'm happy to discuss these and other ideas with the panel and also with the audience, of course. So, so that's all from me. Thanks again for having me, and feel free to reach out for any questions or follow-up comments at any point now or later. For now, I'm really looking forward to the other presentations and to our discussions during the rest of the workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Panicos. Let's now move to the second speaker, Desiree Pacheco, who is going to give a presentation with the title Social Movement and Entrepreneurship. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. And today I decided I'm just broadly going to be talking about entrepreneurship and social movements. This allows me to tell you about many of my papers. So it's my convenient framing for discussing a few of my, some of my work. And so, like I said, it's great to be here. It's ironic that we're so close, yet it's been so far and it's taken this long for us to see each other in person. So 3 studies that I'll be talking about today. One has been published to our working papers, and then I'm going to talk about the general implications for future research in this space. The first paper, published in 2014 in Org Science, looking at the coevolution of industries, of social movements and institutions, is a study of the wind power energy sector in the US. And so with this paper, we started with the notion that there was a lot of variability in terms of looking at, okay, something went off there with the PowerPoint. So there was a lot of variation in terms of installations of wind power capacity throughout the US, as you can see here, and a lot of growth that we observed throughout the same time. Still blank there in the southeast of the country, but definitely a lot of other variation. And with that, what we observed was also the growth of this wind energy industry, and specifically, clean energy social movement organizations is how we call them. These are some examples of them. I've worked with Renewable Northwest in Oregon, and these organizations really take the task of promoting clean renewable energy for the most part. What we do with these organizations is we call them technology-focused SMOs. So we are calling them social movement organizations. They are distinct from trade associations. I don't have a lot of my time here to discuss those differences, but their funding is very different. It's based on grants, et cetera. And they don't just look at wind power or solar. They actually promote the whole spectrum of renewables. It could be wind, it could be solar, it could be geothermal, hydro, et cetera. And they do that in a way, and so as you will see here, if we look at the right-hand side here, they have much more narrow goals than what we would call a generalist SMO, which in the context of wind power, we're referring to the environmental SMOs. We saw them in Colorado, in Oregon, in all the states that we've done research in, also promoting renewables, but in a different way. And so they had a distinct role, and that's what I'll discuss now. The generalist SMOs, much more focused on environmental conservation, air quality, climate change. They have scale and scope advantages in terms of fundraising and shaping policy. And very important, these generalist SMOs have also different strategies. They very much are focused on campaigning against fossil fuel industry. So very much take a confrontational approach to change. Where these specialist TSMOs have more narrow goals, but they still share the goal of improving the environment. That is still, when we've done a lot of qualitative research on the missions of these organizations, I just realized I still have my mask on. No wonder this was so hard. So many of these organizations do have an environmental sort of goal, and that's their mission, but they think of the technology as a means to get to that goal, the environmental goal. Much more specialized knowledge and capabilities. In fact, some of them do hire people from the industry to come in and bring that capability, and they're focused on stimulating generally the adoption of technology. During the same time, we saw a lot of differences when it came to policies. And renewable portfolio standards are the most important policy that we see in the US, where a state mandates that a certain percentage of the electricity in a state comes from renewables. Back then, when we did the study, 28 states had passed it, but a lot of variation in this area. So what we observed is that the growth of wind power in the US was influenced by these generalist environmental SMOs, but also by the specialist clean energy ones, was also influenced by the support of these more formalized policies. But at the same time, this is all explained in a complex coevolutionary process. And so we asked the question, how do SMOs, institutions, and the industry co-evolve to develop a new industry? And this was the model there. So now I'm going to take you in detail into every of these relationships. No, just kidding. So the social movement on our left-hand side, we see the generalist SMOs over there leading to mandatory rules. That's what typically we've seen observed in the literature. Oh, we have all of these NGOs and they're out there, they're pushing the industry through mandatory rules, in this case, to lead to industry growth, to lead to the growth of wind power. And our point is, the story doesn't end here. That's just the beginning. Having more industry growth and having more related knowledge in that industry actually leads to the growth of the specialist SMOs. And the specialist SMOs play a very important role. And their role is to continue to bring awareness and institutionalization in the industry, and also lead and influence the enactment of market incentives that are very specific for solar, for wind, for thermal. And it gets technical. At that point, we don't see the generalists getting that involved. It's these guys that are doing it. Keep pushing the industry overall. And so my point with this is to show that movements and industry and that relationship is complex. And it's much more complex than what we have seen and put out there, that this evolution is dependent not only, and one thing, that movements evolve not just because organizations within movements have to compete with each other, but also because movements depend on the industries that they are supporting. And so this evolution of the movement can be explained by the industries that they support. And in general, that there's, of course, a lot of dependencies across these populations, something that we must consider. I'll take you to the second paper. This is a working paper in solar energy, looking at social movement and entry, and with an ecological perspective. As Panicos just described, there's a lot of research that tells us that SMO participation can lead to emerging industry entry. We just talked about that, but our question was, How does the ecology of the industry itself shape how the movement can help the industry? The movement is not going to be universally able to. What is it about the industry where the movement can sometimes be more helpful than other times? And with that, we actually did this project in the US solar energy contracting industry. In this industry, we also see a lot of variation across states in terms of the number of solar establishments. Same thing if you look at it in terms of solar energy capacity. And we also saw the intervention of these clean energy TSMOs. And so with that in mind, what we've done here is a model that looks at the participation of SMOs and emerging industry depending on that industry ecology. So SMOs here are much more influential at stimulating firm entry when the industry ecology, where everything down here is actually less favorable to entry, right? So that makes sense in this, in looking at it. Well, we need these SMOs when the industry ecology is not providing the right environment. But how exactly is that? Well, it happens when the industry density is either very low, but also when it's too high, and you have too much competition. And so in those conditions, that's why we have a quadratic there, the movement ends up being more important. The movement is also more important when the density of mutualistic industries, these are industries that actually are highly interdependent and share the social values of this industry, in this case, wind power and solar. When wind power is very low, you need the movement more because you don't have that broader legitimacy of the category. Similarly, when the concentration of what we call generalist multi-products, these are firms that not only install solar power, but they also install heating systems and other things for homes and for residents and commercial. That might actually lead to less single product specialists, but we need the movement to help deal with the competition there. So overall, the ecology on its own leads to lower levels of cognitive legitimacy, but the movement can come and compensate for that by bringing the sociopolitical legitimacy that is lacking in the industry. So the implications of this study are that the structural conditions, like I mentioned, really matter in determining the effectiveness of movements. And really important, a lot of the research in social movements is very focused on agency. And our point is we also need to bring structure. And yes, the literature in social movement talks to us about political structures or political opportunities in that structure, but much less so on these ecological structures that we don't quite understand how that relates to movements. Final paper, this is a paper in sustainable apparel. And in this paper, we're looking at how entrepreneurs engage in cultural work and how they bring change into this industry in particular. And it's a US-based study. In the US, when it comes to apparel, the industry is moving slowly towards sustainability. I see much more activity here in Europe than we see in the US. In fact, when I started this paper, I thought I was going to study the movement. And then I realized there's no movement. But there is a little bit of a movement, and I'm going to show you it's a different kind of movement, but I think we need to consider it too. And so very limited intervention of the government here. A few NGOs are active. It's not your typical social movement. And incumbents like Nike, Patagonia, putting efforts out there through organizations like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, but still slow progress. And many have criticized it for that. At the same time, what we notice is the new wave of entrepreneurs out there doing a lot of stuff on sustainable apparel. And so we put together our own database. I've been working on this project now for years because I've had to create everything from scratch, looking at the founding rates of sustainable apparel companies. And as you can see here, for those in our sample, many of them have been founded in the last 10 years or so. And so this is an inductive grounded theory paper looking at newspapers, company websites, interviews, etc., and very much focused on the emergence of the industry in the US. Some of the key things, I'm only going to take you through a little piece of this paper that's related to social movements. And that is that entrepreneurs seem to be in a very unique position to advance change in the industry because also, as Panico was mentioning, their authenticity allows them to engage in what we call productive cultural work. These entrepreneurs very much have and portray a craftsmanship identity. We are craftsmen. And that gives them the license to now go and use culture to criticize the others and to bring change into the industry. And so they apply that craft logic to bridge the environmental and the economic logic. This paper really is a logics paper, but I'm going to now take you a little bit through the movement. This is the movement piece. And here what I want to highlight is that these entrepreneurs, yes, they leverage a sustainable lifestyle movement. They talk a lot about you are vegan, outdoors. You know, this is about lifestyle. This is not just about your apparel. This is about other choices that you make. And in leveraging that movement and that lifestyle movement, they also embed their practices both in the local community by teaching, for example, different garment making skills and getting out there and talking about that, and also through cultural forms of expression. A lot of fashion shows, art exhibits, etc. Right? So they're truly using culture to bring that. They don't just leverage the movement, they also reinforce it with how they're doing this. And so here's an example of a quote. The inspiration behind this collection is to bring awareness of the human impact on environment and to promote social responsibility by adopting sustainable fashion as a lifestyle choice. So it's all about, this is the general choice that you make. The implications of this paper for social movement theory, and sort of where I want to bring it here to your attention, is that there's been a lot of work on thinking about collective action, the collective action perspective of movements. In fact, perhaps we should start with the definition of movement, since this is a workshop in social movements, and perhaps many of you would have collective action in your mind. And my point is, let's maybe think about movements more broadly. There's also cultural and lifestyle movements. There's been literature in this. We're using it in this paper, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue doing that. It's a softer type of movement that does and actually relate to the stronger form of movement that we're typically used to. So putting all of these papers together, the message I want to leave you with is that social movements can be beyond contestation through collective action, like I just said, that we can think of them in terms of lifestyle and cultural movements. And I'll leave you with my final thought, which is entrepreneurship is about change, social movements is about change. So when that change and the direction of that change is aligned, then the question is, how complementary are these efforts? And we're just starting to scratch the surface there. And then on the other side, if they're not aligned, then what are the implications? We see research that tells us that the visibility of a company matters when it comes to whether a movement goes after them. The bigger you are, the more likely you're going to be hit by a movement. But how small can you be to be under the radar? And are entrepreneurs and small businesses really immune to movements? I don't think we really know enough of that to understand it. Thank you. These are just some thoughts. I look forward to discussing it more with you.
Thank you very much, Desiree. Let's now move to our third speaker. She's Simone Schiller-Merkens, and Simone is going to give a presentation with the title Organizing Toward an Alternative Economy, Social Movements and Alternative Organizing. Simone, the floor is yours.
So, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, can you see it? Okay, perfect. So I'm very pleased to be here and being part of this workshop. So compared to the other two presentations that we just heard, mine will be a bit different, and that is based on conceptual work on the one hand, and on the other hand, it might be the most radical one, or more on the social movement side. We have heard a lot on social movements or movements within markets, in industrial markets, and I'm going to talk more about movements that are already organizing toward a change, also outside of markets. So whereas we were supposed to talk a bit about social movements and modern markets, I will broaden it a bit and look also at social movements in the economy, or what has been called economic activism, which is activism that takes place in and through markets, but not only so. So the focus of my talk will be on so-called prefigurative movements, which are movements that organize their economic exchanges in alternative ways, both within markets but also outside of them. And I'm going to talk about that because they are important actors in bringing a new economy about. And we are going to talk about digital economy later, so maybe that'd be helpful. So we currently live in an era of multiple interwoven crises: the global pandemic, climate change, high levels of inequality, poverty, and further threats to our democracies through racism and the rise of populism. These crises have intensified the debate about our current economic system, and there are many who see these major challenges related to the kind of economy in which we currently live. Critical voices not only relate to the neoliberal policies that brought about the expansion of markets to ever more spheres of our lives. Many also claim that the underlying principles of our economy, profit maximization, competition, and economic growth, have led to the exploitation of both people and the planet. So we might ask them, are there any alternatives to our predominant ways of organizing the economy? Well, indeed, there are. On the one hand, there are theoretical models for an alternative economy. So just think about a few of them, like participatory economics, degrowth economy, community economics. But there are also movements already implicated in building alternatives on the ground, and this is what we are going to look at now. So, for instance, we have, particularly in German-speaking countries, the movement Economy for the Common Good, and the creation of common good organizations, where the idea is that the central values of firms should be to primarily work for human dignity, solidarity, and sustainability. Then we have the long tradition of cooperatives that witness a revival, and also in relation to several movements, such as degrowth or democratizing work. We have community-supported agriculture, where new relationships based on the principle of solidarity are created between food producers and consumers. There are eco-villages, there are worker-recovered enterprises, particularly in Latin America, usually also organized as cooperatives. And there are many more, such as social solidarity economy movement, with many social enterprises in the world attached to it. What unites all of these initiatives and makes them alternatives is that they try to realize alternative moral values in their practices. And we can draw on the late Eric Olin Wright, who was one of the most prolific writers on social transformation. And he proposed a set of principles, including equality and fairness, democracy and freedom, and community and solidarity. Or we can equally build on Martin Parker and his colleagues, who define alternative organizations as organizations that realize the values of autonomy, solidarity, and responsibility. So despite the great variety between these organizations and communities, they also all are united in that they pursue an activist agenda. So meaning that all of them seek to change the economy. They all try to create a better economy in the present and already live in alternative ways in their daily practices. And this is why they are also referred to as prefigurative social movements. All of the mentioned examples show that movements have started to construct alternatives, and this is a fundamental shift in their activism. Originally, social movements mainly targeted the political arena, and to effectuate changes in the economy, they demanded appropriate regulatory changes from the state. Today, movements also engage in economic activism. They directly intervene into the economy and what we heard before, and that includes both protest actions, such as boycotts or demonstration, and constructive forms of activism, like contributing to the construction of moral markets. And this also, is something also what pertains to this area, is called prefiguration. In prefiguration, movements use direct social action, whereby they focus upon directly transforming some aspects of society by means of the very action itself. So you can also say that movements engage in prefigurative politics, which means that their ongoing social practices embody their goals and visions of an alternative future. We can also say that through their practices, they live the change they want to see in the economy as a whole. This shift toward prefiguration became most visible in the wake of the Great Recession, particularly in Southern Europe and, of course, also very much in Spain, that was hit hard by the austerity measures. A lot of solidarity initiatives were created during that time, such as food banks, collective purchasing groups, or free legal and medical services. Together with the examples we have just seen, all of them constitute a fundamental change in how economic goods are produced, consumed, and distributed or shared, and thereby they prefigure how an alternative economy might look like. This is why social transformation scholars consider these prefigurative initiatives as core actors in transforming our economies. Wright refers to them as real utopias. They allow insights into an alternative way of life that seems utopian for some, but these organizations are already there. They are real and show that an alternative organizing of economic exchanges is feasible. But when we look at them, most of them emerge at the margins of society, in free spaces and niches that allow them to be different. They are fringe alternatives, not widely perceived as viable on a broader scale. So alternative organizing is still mainly taking place at the local level, on the ground of particular organizations and communities. The central questions are then, how can their values, beliefs, and practical embodiments of alternative organizing become more widespread in society? How can these prefigurative movements organize toward an alternative economy? Wright would say that these are tricky research questions because they are addressing a future that is not yet there. But we can theorize about them by building on existing research, and there's an extensive body of studies on the collective action of movements, and we just heard it. In particular, informative are studies that look into the outcome of movements and the question of when and how movements matter. So building on social movement studies tells us two main things about how movements matter and contribute to social change. One is they need to get support from political and rule-setting actors and institutions. They need to find influential allies, and this also includes powerful allies beyond the political arena, like in science or the economy and markets. The other important thing is that movements have to mobilize between themselves. They have to build connections between the different prefigurative movements, between, let's say, common good organizations, post-growth organizations, and social enterprises of various sorts. And they do so both by creating brokering organizations that help them to do so, and by using digital tools. And this is something I'm sure that we're going to talk about later during our workshop. When we look at the scholarship on social transformation, they also claim that these two things are important. So creating connections both within the movement sector and to the political arena. For Wright, it is even the most promising way toward an alternative economy. So combining the collective action in civil society, where alternatives are already prefigured in free spaces, with interventions from the state to expand those spaces. Social movement scholarship is also helpful to theorize about when prefigurative movements are likely to organize toward an alternative economy. So what are the contextual conditions for having an impact? But I think for reasons of time, I will go to the next slides now. So, of course, any transformation of our economy would be a contentious process, rife with struggles. And here we can build on insights not only from social movement studies, but also we have all the studies on alternative organizing, hybrid organizations, social entrepreneurship, and institutional change. Struggles arise within and between prefigurative movements, such as when hierarchical authority relations develop unintendedly, despite the ideal of horizontality. Also, when we look at the heterogeneity of actors who are currently involved in prefigurative organizations, there's a great variety of ideas, beliefs, and collective identities. And that will cause contestation and moral struggles about, for instance, the most appropriate practices of alternative organizing, about how to achieve social transformation, so the strategy of social transformation, about whether to collaborate with the state or incumbent economic actors or not, or about accepting formal structures in the form of brokering organizations. In particular, the last two aspects are particularly critical, or an issue would be an issue for initiatives that have a more anarchist identity. Furthermore, there will also be struggles in relation to the context and the connections to outside actors. The rise of counter-movements is very likely, particularly when we consider that the moral principles of alternative organizing are conflicting with the ones that currently dominate our economy. Struggles can also arise in collaborations with firms and public authorities. And we know about the threats of co-optation or mission drift. So to conclude, the question of how organizations and communities that prefigure an alternative economy can help us organizing toward it on a broader scale is an important one when we look at the serious problems that we face in the world. And it provides us with a lot of research questions. For example, we need to better understand how these prefigurative movements engage in collective action, what major struggles arise in their everyday activities, and how they tackle them, how and under which conditions prefigurative organizations achieve which kinds of outcomes beyond their own boundaries, and thereby contribute to a broader social change. We can also look into the question of whether and how crises like the pandemic or economic recessions affect prefigurative movements and the diffusion of alternative organizing. So yes, there's already research on alternative organizing, on hybrid organizations, social enterprises, time banks, fair trade organizations, cooperatives. And we have learned a lot about the struggles of organizing differently. But our insights mostly derive from case studies that focus on particular kinds of prefigurative organizations. We do not know yet what happens when these start mobilizing among each other to collectively work towards changing our economies. And that brings me to my final thought is, well, we might also rethink our research more generally. What I have talked about is not something that we can directly observe and practice. Well, of course, alternative organizing exists, and we do have studies on alternative organizations, but neither do we see the envisioned connections across them, at least not on a larger scale, nor are there any fundamental outcomes on the economy that can be related back to their collective action. This is why I share with others the belief that we should continue exploring these real utopias that do exist, but also theorize about the possible trajectories of transformation and the conditions to, outcomes of, and struggles around them. And this is something that involves, to quote Wright, more speculative and contentious claims about what could be, and not just about what is. Ali and Juliane Reinecke recently also wrote about it. They said that in the light of the performative role of science, we should theorize about the future to help bringing about a desirable one. This is important also because we thereby co-create more positive imaginaries of the future. We do have all the talk about the serious problems, which is very important indeed. But people are also looking for ideas on how a positive future might look like, and they want to know what to do, how to get there. We as researchers should therefore continue working on what Parker described as a positive critique which brings new things into the world. Wright called it a social science of the possible. It is a science that provides imaginaries of a desirable and positive future. Thank you very much.
Simone. Well, now it's time to open this session for a debate. We encourage all the audience that is online and in the room just to start. Those who are online, you can submit your questions through the chat. Let's start if there's anybody in the room who wants to start. make any questions to any of the three speakers. David, please.
Thank you to the three panelists for a very interesting first session. There was a concept that came to my mind immediately in the first, in the first paper, and I finally saw it in one of the final slides that Simone shared with us, which is the concept of mission drift. I'm more interested individually. I mean, my interest has always been in how social movements are being transformed by markets, not the other way around. So not even a critique, but my comment to the first two presentations is that, in a way, your point of departure is very static about how the way that social movements are and are going to be. And obviously, we need to discount that there is a dual effect of social movements transforming markets, but again, as an activist, I'm more interested into what Sandel, the philosopher, would call the crowding out of intrinsic motivation, intrinsic values. So this cooptation that appeared in the final slide, one of the final slides of Simone's presentation. And here I might take, and I'm not an expert on mission drift, but it's a worry that troubles me, is what is your knowledge about this other side of the coin, about how markets transform social movements, how co-opt them, and can we be a bit optimistic about the other side of the coin that you didn't show that much? Thank you very much.
Yeah, any of the three would like to start answering?
Can we give a quick answer, if that's okay? I don't think we have a full answer because a lot of the research, I think you actually characterized the literature quite well, because there's certainly a lot of research looking at mission drift and cooptation of social movements, but especially in the area of organizations and management economics, most of that has been focusing on thinking about how that affects the development of the market, right? So the mainstreaming of the market or the failure for the market to become mainstream, rather than thinking about how that affects activists themselves. So I think you actually pointed out to an interesting opportunity for future work and also for informing practice, because while there is some work in sociology in terms of how cooptation of social movement organizations occurs, there's certainly not enough that we know about this. I think going back to also what Desi was saying, the social movements and markets, they co-evolve, right? So one certainly affects the other, and we usually think about only one side, one direction. We usually think about the direction of how they affect market outcomes rather than social movement outcomes. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that's some.
Thank you.
I'll point out that I think that is a very good comment, and there is so much opportunity in that space, because there is, like Panico says, very little that we understand. I think to that regard, an example that comes to mind for me is organic foods in the U.S., a movement that began, and now we see certification. But many farmers will actually argue that what the market did by putting the certification was minimalize, right, the efforts that needed to be done and set it up as a checklist. And so have we seen an uprise of that? No. But the question is, do sometimes movement just strike back and say, no, this is not what we asked from the market? And I'm just invite us all to think about if we've seen those examples out there and how we might be able to explore this further. Because indeed, sometimes in these types of examples, the market takes the demands of the movement, but makes it their own and to what's convenient and available to with the economic logic. And so what comes next after that? I don't know that we know enough about that. So great comment.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you again. I also agree with my colleagues that of course, there's so much work missing on social movement organizations, social movements themselves, and the question of mission drift. One thing is, I mean, there is work on the collective identity on the organizational identity of social movement organizations, and that some of them are, such as Greenpeace, for instance, they would not collaborate with firms. So they have more a confrontational tactic, or they employ confrontational tactics to influence markets and the economy, whereas others are more leaned towards collaborating with firms and in that way, and these are particularly have difficulties in remaining, as activists as before, as radical maybe as before. I can also, I mean, I don't know, I haven't analyzed by myself social movement organizations, but I have analyzed activist entrepreneurs in the ethical fashion market. And what I have seen over time is that indeed, that the longer they are in the business and the longer they have to show that they are also a respectable and legitimate part of the fashion industry as a whole, the more they turn towards using economic and business logics to position themselves in the market. So yes, it is true that even they keep their activist agenda, at least in their positioning outwards, they won't, this will be crowded out over time.
Okay, let me read one question that is in the chat before we give the opportunity to the audience here. There's one question which I guess is for Simone. The question says, the comment says, theorizing is good and start from academia. How this reaches critical mass to realize this alternative economy?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, the last sentence?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's for Simone, but if any from the three want to react, it's,
yeah.
It says, theorizing is a good and a start from academia. How does this reach critical mass to realize this alternative economy?
Okay. So behind this question, I read that you think that the critical mass is, or that we can only reach a critical mass through collaborating with economic actors. Is that so? And if we understand it like that, I would say, yes, indeed, that might be one aspect. So we need more research also about what happens then to these social movement organizations and also to economic actors. Do they transform truly the way markets and the economy works, or is it more that the movements become co-opted? And I want to go to another question that is related. So we might also want to talk about our understanding of what a moral market is, because as far as I see it, is we talk a lot about moralized markets right now, which means that market actors, that firms now start moralizing by using moral values, to position themselves and to legitimate their doing in different ways. But the question is, we see so much moralization around. So I would say in every industry, we now have moralization going on. As you meant, every firm, each firm says that they are sustainable, that they are respecting the values of the nature of the people, and so on. So the question then becomes: are these all working in moral markets, or are these just moralized markets? And do we need a difference between moralized markets and moral markets, where moral markets are the ones where the economic principles are balanced, or maybe even subsumed under the moral values? So I'm not sure. So maybe we can discuss that with the audience as well.
Thank you very much, Simone.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much for the session. Super interesting. Actually, I have a couple of questions. One was related with something that Simone was saying now, and I know that's kind of a tricky question to ask. Is, I mean, what do we mean? And I know that you have been confronted with this for years, I assume. What actually moral means when we talk about moral markets, right? And this is connected with the second question, which is also like a puzzle that I have, which is that, so in the different presentations, there seems to me that there is an absent actor, which is the state, right? So what is the role of the state in these different pictures, right? So for instance, thinking about Desiree's presentation, which I found it super interesting, right? But now I couldn't stop thinking about what is going on here in Europe, but in particular in Spain, when we talk about, so we see an emergence of I don't know where they are coming from, entrepreneurs offering clean energy and so on and so forth. So I was wondering, is this related with any sort of social movements? Is it related with, is an opportunity that they see? And of course, it is related with the state, it is related with the next generation thing, right? So what is the role of the state in all the pictures that we have here, the different stories that you are telling, right? So again, I was saying, is this like the absent actor that we have? Because also I was thinking about somehow, and perhaps this is my own bias, I was thinking about the work of Flickstein, right? And Flickstein talks about the importance of the state as the fundamental, one of the fundamental actors defining market institutions. So in some of the industries you're referring to, the state has been there defining the rules, setting the pillars of what he calls the market there. So what is actually there? And actually, I was also thinking about this. I'll stop it there. When hearing Simone, because actually, one thing that is very interesting about a number of these prefigurative initiatives or movements that you were referring to, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, they actually try to make a deliberate movement to escape, to move out, right, from the society. And partly because they consider that there is no institutional channels that they can use in order to transform the reality, right? So again, plenty of different things. But again, thanks so much for a very thoughtful session. Thank you.
Thank you. Any reaction?
I'll start with your last question on the state role of the state, and then maybe. So to your point, I mean, absolutely, I think the role of the state is crucial. And if I underrepresented that in my presentation, I think it's important to highlight that it isn't. In fact, when we look at, in general, social movement theory, where all this started was really looking at how movements were changing and transforming policies, all the way from civil rights movement, and we see it now with the environmental movement and all of that. And so perhaps if it's less represented is because it's trying to rebalance the fact that so much of social movement theory was based on transforming and changing state level action. And so in my model, everything that I had in the middle in that in the first model, that's all state level. And that's all coming from the government enacting that. The point is the movement starting the mobilization to eventually convince the state to make those changes. And so indeed, but very important and very crucial, because on the one hand, I think there's different mechanisms and pathways that we see with social movements. They work directly to the individual, to the consumer. They work to the industry, but also indirectly through government. And those are all very important pathways to consider. And I try to look at all of them in my research together because, and that's why quickly it gets very complex, because we have indirect and direct pathways to changing industry and consumer behavior as well.
So let me add to that as well, because I definitely agree that this is a very important comment. And as Desiree said, a lot of the research on social movements started by looking at how they influence state policy. So we are actually not the majority of, in terms of studying markets and market outcomes. I mean, in an ideal world, we would probably not need social movements in the sense that, the moralization of markets would be kind of enforced by the state. But of course, some of the reasons why social movements appear and they are becoming, in general, civil society is becoming more and more prominent is because of limited state intervention in some markets. So that's one of the reasons maybe why it was underrepresented in our presentations, although I think in much of the work that we discussed, the state is very prominent as well. The other thing that's important is that one of the main ways by which social movements influence markets or modern markets is by changing or helping to change state regulation, right? So you mentioned the example of clean tech companies in Spain, and there, in some of my research as well, I've seen that the state policies have been really fundamental for the development of the industry, but also for the demise of the industry. So when policies, supporting policies were gone, then you would see like a very steep decline. So it still remains one of the, especially at the early stages of these markets, being able to influence state and state policy is probably the most important mechanism to actually change the market.
Thank you, Panicos.
Yes, and I think we might add to that. I mean, it's, on the one hand, we really need the rule-setting role of the state is very important, also to further shape the transformation of markets toward more moral ones. On the other hand, also, this is something that Eric Olin Wright discusses a lot, and other researchers as well, that we look at social transformation, is the question of how the state beyond rule setting can also support these the emergence and the development of these alternative organizations. And one is also to give to provide them with various kind of resources, not only financial ones but also social ones, in terms of helping them to cooperate, to communicate. And maybe we can talk about later also how digitalization can contribute to that. Yes. So, thank you, Ignacy.
Let me read one question. It's coming from the chat, which relates to the last comment made by Ignacy in the first question, which reads as follows. It says, don't we need to problematize morality? For example, financial traders, CEOs, fascists, and so forth have moral codes and applied rules, correct? So I think this relates to the first comment from Ignacy about the concept of moral. No? Any reaction about that, linking the first question from Ignacy with these questions from the chat?
So there are two views on what is moral. One is that moral is something that is constructed by a certain community. And the other one is that it is already given. So, but I can tell you what when I talk about moral markets, my understanding is maybe a more radical one, which is these markets are moral when they are alternative, when they are based on the set of alternative principles that I just described. So, and that means that we can really reflect upon whether all of these markets that we have talked about are really moral markets or not more moralized markets, where some values become important, but the most prominent ones remain the economic ones. And I think moral markets are alternative markets where the most prominent values are not the economic ones. They might be balanced, but they are not the most important ones. So that's my understanding. Might be a bit radical, yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, let's go to another question.
Hello? Yes. It became clear to me in the different presentations that there were that the role of social movements to transform industry practices and markets is key, but also that there are different types of social movements, the more general ones, more, I don't know how you call it, technologically specific social movements, or these prefigurative movements. And this kind of variety, I wasn't clear if you see it as in a way, as an advantage or as a disadvantage if we want to promote a transformation that is needed to face our social environmental challenges. In other words, the variety is a good thing because they complement each other, and at the end, this is driving change, or is becoming an obstacle for collaboration and to create greater change. I don't know if you have a view about this issue.
So let me try to give a quick answer. I think it also relates to one of the comments earlier. Somebody was talking about whether we should be satisfied with like transformation, like let's say incremental changes versus radical approach, right? And some of the problems that Simone mentioned require that we really change the way we organize our economy and markets really fast, right? So especially if we're talking about things like climate change. And I think to go back to your comment, I think we do need different types of movements and different types of efforts. On one hand, we can try to change, markets, how to use how markets work in order to get more favorable social and environmental outcomes, right? But at the same time, we also need to think about how we transform, what markets really are, right? And the value, infuse these values that Simone was talking about into markets, rather than thinking about the kind of traditional profit maximization approach. I'm not sure one way or the other is going to be more effective in terms of kind of moving fast. I think we probably need to work on both at the same time, given the challenges that we're facing and how quickly we need to transform. But certainly, I wouldn't think that we need to focus on only one or the other. But that's, of course, speculative.
Okay, of course.
I think of your question, I think it's a very good question, Daniel, in two ways. One is that change requires, and I'm going back to institutional change. And I think institutions come in different forms. And we can think about governance structures at the very top, the very formal institutions that economists would typically tell us, and then it can go all the way down to much more informal institutions, values, culture, norms. And so as we go down that spectrum of institutions, we need different strategies to tackle them. Because in my view, if we're talking about formal institutions, going back to the point that was made here, we need more of the typical collective action movement, where if we're going all the way down to the very structure of our culture and our values, yes, collective action is also perhaps important, but that's where I start to see the other types of movements and organizing as influencing it. And so in terms of institutions, because there are different types, I think there are different movements that are necessary for those types. Then just generally speaking, when we think about the nature of the problems as well that we have to tackle, I can see how, and because with the nature of the problem comes the nature of the stakeholders that need to come in. We're trying to transform entire systems, and the systems have different stakeholders. And when that stakeholder is a large corporation, very often we need collective action. And that will lead us to bigger change, indeed. But we also need to, and I've actually created, I have a totally different paper that I didn't bring in today that talks about the systems and the different stakeholders and the different strategies that are necessary to tackle those different stakeholders. And I think all of them are important because all stakeholders matter. From a market perspective, the large industrial players matter, but so does the consumer, because the consumer drives the demand for that particular player. And so I think to address consumers, we do need more of these softer types of movements. So I'd love to talk to you more about it later, but.
Okay, thank you very much, Desiree. Well, it's time. I know there's some questions probably during coffee break or at the end, it's good time. There's also some comments in the chat, something that self-referential for us who are in business schools, like how should business schools curriculums change in this context? Okay, something food for thought and further discussion during the coffee break probably. So now it's time to the end of this first session. We have arrived to the end. So thank you very much to the three speakers for sharing your research and engaging us in such a rich debate. So thank you very much. A big applause.
Thank you.
Thanks also all of the audience for the questions. And now we will turn to the second session, which will be led by David Murillo, and the title is Alternative Forms of Organizing the Digital Wall. So thank you.
So this second session is called Alternative Forms of Organizing in the Digital World. And as you can imagine now, the highlight or the accent is going to be put on the digital part. Huh? Our attempt now is to move away a bit from the ordinary critique done to platform capitalism. Probably you have heard both audience here and those at home on recent books like Surveillance Capitalism, published by Zuboff, concepts and themes like extractivism through data or data acquisition, acceleration, behavioral engineering, biases, manipulation. All this is part of the cloud of concepts that we, in a way, want to fight against. Now I'm saying that I'm using the mask and there is no need here, so you can breathe a bit better if you want to. So the idea would be to with the assistance of three prominent scholars that I'm going to introduce in a second, to try to highlight and seek and look at avenues or pathways towards an alternative digital system. There are, again, interestingly, a number of recent works on, for instance, themes like platform cooperativism. Those that might remember the book published by Scholz in 2016. Interesting work done by Morozov and Bria on the democratization of urban digital infrastructure. Same, there are plenty of publications, not that many in our field in management studies, though they are popping up, papers on the governance through blockchain infrastructure, peer-to-peer, trustless systems, and so on, even if each of these words should deserve a caveat and a footnote. So in a way, what we want to go is to look beyond the ordinary ways to understand how to do business and how to organize in the digital world. So we have three interesting, hopefully very interesting for you, scholars and practitioners at the same time. We will start with Dr. Ali Aslan Gumuzey, the head of research group at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin. And he will talk about grand challenges and diverse forms of organizing in the digital world. Then we will continue here. Thanks very much for coming from Copenhagen. It deserves some recognition. We are not used anymore to this type of people coming from abroad to be with us. This is what we have missed this last month with the pandemic. So we have here Mikkel Flyverboom as well, professor with special responsibilities in communication and digital transformation, and co-director of the Digital Transformations Platform at Copenhagen Business School. He's the author of the Digital Prism, by the way, an interesting book that might be of your interest as well. And then we will close with the last presentation run by Marina Micheli, who is the scientific project officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and she will basically share her insights on a project called DigiTranscope, research on data governance conducted in this exploratory research. So each of the speakers will have, I asked them to try to be strict with the times, some 15 minutes to present, and then as we've done before, we will collect the questions and we will basically start the discussion. So Dr. Ali Aslan Gumuzey, thanks for being with us. I guess that you see us, we still don't see you. Now you're coming up here. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you, David. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you, albeit only digitally. So it's also a shame and a bit sad not to be with you in person. I think, these topics, they often require the coffee breaks for intellectual exchange. The curious moments that spark novelty, I think, happen oftentimes over coffee. And then also, I think, the topic, and I think that's what is behind this conference, is not just a conference for the mind, but also for the heart. So I think we have, and you've invited people who are like-minded, but also like-hearted. And I think this common passion is easier to be conveyed when being there in person. But this is then the second best option, and I'm grateful to be with you. I guess maybe also, this allows me to be not careful to say that I'm looking forward to Germany or Turkey winning the European Championship. I think I would be more hesitant to say something like that whilst being in Spain. But that's a different topic, I think, football, although there are alternative forms of organizing also in football. Let me actually start with an observation. So on Twitter, a colleague asked for leads on any prior literature on how organization and management studies were not adequately addressing current social issues, such as the financial crisis, the pandemic, or the rise of populism. Right? So that was just actually at the beginning of this week, he asked this question. And the response to this request were some classics, including pieces by Barley, Heinings, and Greenwood in ASQ. And there's also some really good discussions in the Journal of Management Studies in their kind of discourse sections and on the future of organization theory. Then there are lots of news sections actually, and just one popped up in Business and Society. So there are things happening there, right? And then there's research on grand challenges, and that's something I mentioned in this. What are these societal grand challenges? They are social, they're of social or ecological or ecological nature. So they are societal, they are large, they're grand, and they're not resolved. They are challenges, right? Such as the climate, the coming or the current climate emergency, and the current human inequality. And so people mentioned also pieces like the one by Jerry George et al. In AMJ on grand challenges, or Ferraro et al. In Org Studies, so Fabrizio, Joel, and Draw, where they talked about grand challenges. And I think all this really is I think one approach towards this topic, right? To think about the grand challenges perspective. And I bring this up, and I'll be very, I'll mention a couple of things and try to be very concise in these 50 minutes. I think one perspective which helps us to address these topics about alternative, diverse forms of organizing and societal concerns is this grand challenges perspective, because it is not a theory in itself, but it's a perspective which has a theoretical potential. So especially in our field, in our community, it allows us to address certain topics from a theoretical perspective, and also even offering us to give a theoretical contribution. I have so no PowerPoint slides, but links, and someone in the back will share with you links when I say the numbers, so to say. So those of you online have access to these links. So link 1, please. Link 1 is just a reference to an organization theory piece on grand challenges and institutional theory. And just if you're interested in this discourse on grand challenges, I guess there are 2 ways towards it. One is to take a piece like that, which is quite recent, and see who we cite. And another one would be to go to these kind of first pieces from Jerry George or Fabrizio and al. And see who these scholars, who are they referenced by later on. Now, personally, when I read the tweet, I responded that I see a recent wave of scholarship that engages deeply with the intersection of business and society, that wishes to make societal concerns front and center. And I guess, maybe let me be clear, scholars have been addressing societal issues for a long time, right? The social issues in management, the SIM division was one of the first group of divisions at AUM. But I believe that there's a shift in the number of scholars and the amount of scholarship engaging with the business and society interface. And in this regard, I just mentioned before, journals also established new formats. So somehow we think that the current existing way of publishing is not sufficient. It's good, and we need complementary ways to. And one example would be the Business and Society Commentary, I think, which was just launched a couple of weeks ago, or the Journal of Management Studies blog post section, right, which was launched at the beginning of the year. So there are different ways, I think, that we as scholars try to bring in normative questions, reflective questions, and an engagement with society, both in substance and in format, right? So it's not only that what we talk about, but also how we talk about it and with who we talk about it, really to transfer, to engage, to discuss with society these common concerns. And this conference, I believe, speaks to this wave of scholarship. Now, if we look at alternative forms of organizing in the digital world, what do we see? I mean, I think we see new ways to organize due to one, and this is, I think, what we've seen a bit or a lot in the first session on social movements. We see new organizational practices, right? And from my own work, I mean, I've seen things popping up like a feminist co-working space, right? So feminist values, self-defined by the field, trying to shape a co-working space, or violence-free organizing, right? Oftentimes these things are linked to the future of work, right? And wondering and asking and questioning, how should we actually organize? How should practices be different? And then there is the second part to it, right? So we have alternative forms of organizing, and then the digital world. We have new digital tools that are not tools in themselves, but they obviously, and there's a nice piece by Werner Glaser actually in Org Theory about algorithms and how it's socially constructed. But we see blockchain, platforms, AI, so new technologies kind of emerging, and these technologies obviously also shape the way we organize, right? Blockchains maybe through the growing list of records, reducing uncertainty. Platforms as distance bridging technological infrastructures and matchmakers and multi-sided markets, offering new ways to do business, right? New business models. Or AI, artificial intelligence, so intelligence demonstrated by machines, really allowing new ways to automate things, to organize, to lead, and so on. And just another example, I mean, we've just received a conditional accept for a piece in 2 weeks ago, where we look at the digital social movement, so linked to the first session, and how Xiaohin, so how this organization, and if anyone wishes to read it, I'm happy to share it if you drop me an email. So how this organization uses technologies, or is, I mean, not just using it, but how it engages with technology to further its own movement, right? And just a brief kind of snippet from that piece, they first used TitanPad, and then they were hijacked by right-wing people. So right-wings tried to hijack the TitanPad debate, and they were quite successful because of the affordances of TitanPad. And then they moved to Twitter, and again, right-wing people tried to hijack the hashtag Xiaohin, right? So to kind of show daily racism. But there, the interesting thing is the way Twitter works was, on the one hand, they tweeted with the hashtag Xiaohin, but they tweeted racist slur or ambiguous kind of tweets. But what's interesting is, while on TitanPad they were totally destructive, the technological affordances of Twitter actually meant that while they might have kind of shaped the content a bit and what this means, in terms of the number of tweets, actually the racist tweets added towards the number of tweets for Xiaohin, and it became a trending topic in Germany. Not maybe necessarily because of these racist tweets, but the interesting thing is, I think, conceptually, that the way the platform Twitter works is that any tweet you do with that hashtag adds to the number of tweets, and actually your hashtag might become trending topic because people who dislike it support it. Right? So all these things that really, I mean, can be summed up that we need to look at these alternative, novel, diverse forms of organizing, and we also need to reflect on how we want to call them, right? So we call them alternative here. I use the word diverse. I mean, alternative, Gibson, Graham, and others find that alternative might not be the right word because it's performatively putting you at the side. At the same time, it obviously might show some kind of performativity towards that you are an alternative to off the center. Novelty is another challenge, and here maybe the second link, please. In RSO, we've published a piece where we thought about the novelty, so new forms of organizing, and again, it's a tricky word, and there's obviously debates whether something is new. We examined a digital social incubator, right? And that digital social incubator, and maybe so the way we define novelty is really emic. So we said if something is novel in a field, kind of understood as novel by the field, people behave as if it is novel. And that incubator faced certain problems. For instance, it wanted to meet digitally annually, and it wasn't legally allowed to do so. And that shows that way of organizing was perceived novel. There were no rules to make this possible. So this digital social incubator was or is hybrid in both substance and mode of organizing. Its mission was to integrate domains of religion, commerce, and community. And its mode of organizing really straddled the digital analog divide. Neither incubates, so we call it incubate in the paper, incubates members, nor its external stakeholders could rely on existing institutional templates to make sense of it. So it was not only organizationally new, but also institutionally novel. And as a consequence, it experienced what we distinguish as descriptive and evaluative challenges. It was both not understood, and not accepted. So in contrast to the liability of newness, a very well-known concept, right? The liability of newness, we say that new ventures might also face a liability of novelty. And figuring out new forms, new forms of organizing, face these dual challenges of explaining and justifying new templates to external audiences, while also internal constituents are still figuring out how the logics they represent interrelate. So it's really a novel form which has added kind of complexity vis-a-vis the liability of newness. Now, all this is really to say, and just to give you a couple of glimpses, is to say that we really need more work on new, alternative, diverse forms of organizing due to, one, their organizational distinctiveness, and two, their digital distinctiveness. Now, then the question obviously as scholars is how to find them. And one approach we've heard from Simone is real utopias. So Eric Olin Wright's piece, or Heterotopias by Foucault. And I believe it is useful to study examples of alternative, diverse forms of organizing, real utopias really on the periphery of the mainstream, which demonstrate on a small scale what could be possible. Right? And one comment was whether they just want to stay in the periphery. I think that's also really important, but there's a potential for them to become mainstream. And that is something worth observing, especially if we think about the normativity of scholarship, like, right? By examining something empirically, we might choose normatively that case, but we can still be quite descriptive in our scholarly endeavors. So such works on heterotopia and real utopias allows us to access empirical data while also generating novel insights and implications that can be translated into the center of society. In other words, focusing on the periphery allows scholars to contribute changing the mainstream. So we as academics then co-create social change by theorizing and legitimizing its occurrences at the fringe. Now, there is, however, also an answer that lies beyond such kind of search for empirical alternatives through acts of disciplined imagination. And this is maybe the third link is a piece in Journal of Management Studies, which Simone kindly also mentioned, published with Johanne Reinecke. So in it, we kind of say that it's not about anticipating or predicting a probable future. Instead, we need to reclaim our societal relevance by redefining our purpose in engaging with the future and articulate desirable futures and how they might become reality. But then obviously, how can this be done while maintaining scholarly rigor is a key question. And this really requires us to go beyond studying social reality as it exists and how it came to be towards generating new visions of desirable futures along with productive insights to form and transform it, right? And what does it mean, for instance, for rigor? We call this speculative rigor that we need. What does it mean for organizations? If you think about real utopias, they are, I mean, as Simone mentioned, they have a prefigurative kind of potential. We think imagining these before has actually a prefigurative potential. So research can and should have both a preparatory and a performative potential to equip us for and lead towards these desired future or desired futures. So in addition to studying real utopias, alternative forms of digital organizing and so on, there also exist there is also potential to study organizations that do not yet exist or have not yet scaled, right? I mean, an organization that has not yet scaled, again, is you can imagine it to scale and think about this. And effectively, what we try to say here is we need to go from prefactual, or we need to go from prefactual, or actually from postfactual to prefactual, right? So kind of switching the Trumpian situation to actually creating prefactual situations. How to go about it? I mean, I mentioned that we can examine these real utopias, we can examine imaginative facts, we can imagine acts of deliberation. I mean, another example in the piece we say is if you think about Martin Luther King's dream, this has been analyzed a lot, obviously, by scholars. But I mean, what if, I mean, that's a question we could ask, what if the dream becomes reality? What does that mean for organization theory, right? For theorizing organizing, for theorizing practices? What if certain things become reality? So that's one. Another way forward is to examine moments of crisis, which kind of can serve as critical junctures, and look at what happens there. And here, if you could share links 4, 5, and 6. And again, just to give you some thoughts here. I mean, in our work, we looked at digital organizations in Afghanistan, for instance. That's the fourth link, where crisis is the kind of the exogenous shock creating digital organizing, right? I mean, if you can't go outside, you try to organize yourself inside, maybe through digital means. The second one the other example was we looked at what Corona does actually to organizing. And obviously, because of Corona, we create physical distancing, right? We have physical distancing like now. What does that mean? Actually, digital tools were used to kind of organize ourselves, right? And in a piece in the Journal of Business Venture Insights, we look at how the response to physical distancing was digital coordination and digital services and so on. And another example, which is a piece which is right now in a review, we look at Israel-Palestine and how, while borders may be closed physically, the IT sector still works across borders through digital technologies. So again, a crisis, a conflict, maybe a war happening at a place, and how then digital means actually impact the way organizations structure themselves. So all these have implications on what and how to study. And then as a last note, and then I'll come to an end, is I think we not only need to think about researching new, alternative, diverse forms of organizing, but also obviously kind of think about what this means for us as an academic community. And I think this has popped up in the first session. And we need to think, for instance, so are there certain expertise, are there certain team structures we need to rethink, right? And here, if you could share the seventh link, so the last link, European Management Review. And then, I mean, if you haven't shared any other links, just feel free to share them, because I'm coming to a close now. And in that, John Amos and I will look at how actually scholarly teams need to mirror the social complexity to better understand them, right? And if you think about digital technologies, then how do we actually get the right scholars into our PhD programs, for instance, so that they mirror the social complexity? How can we work actually with practitioners in this field? So how do we obtain the contextual expertise needed for digital societal kind of concerns, but also for these new alternative forms of organizing, including language, including cultural understandings? I think our scholarly sphere is still quite homogeneous, and that's something we need to work on as well. So to come to a close, to conclude, is one, I think in terms of the research agenda, we need to examine further these new forms of organizing that are shaped by digital as well as organizational trends and novel practices, right? So researching alternative, diverse, new forms of organizing in the digital realm. This also includes the imagination of empirical data that does not yet exist, right, but may exist in the future. And maybe just as a bracket, I mean, why can't we theorize the Corona crisis before it happens so that we are well prepared when it happens from a theoretical perspective? Second, I think we need to rethink our what this means then for a conceptual focus, right? I think a lot of us care about impact. We care about meta questions, right? About large-scale concerns, and we want to rethink theorizing. And I think the grand challenges is one perspective allowing us to engage with normative questions in a maybe non-normative way, right? And offer some theoretical insights. And then lastly, I think we need to reflect our own practices, our community practices, and also the way we exchange. And I think this conference, and that's why it's just such a shame that we can't be in person. I think it are these platforms that we need, and we see more of them. We see RRBM, we see the organizations, Scholars for Future, mirroring the Fridays for Futures, and so on. So we see new ways of organizing ourselves actually popping up. And I think we need more of these things to not to substitute or replace existing scholarship, but really to enrich and complement that and offer other ways and other kind of career progressions to work in academia that also allow to have impact in manifold ways. And with that, I say, I guess, thank you, and yield the floor back to Barcelona. And the floor seems, or the chair seems to be empty.
There is an empty seat here. Okay, thanks a lot, Ali, for helping us to think about how to theorize the changes brought about by the digital world. Now we move on to the interplay between organizing, governance, and politics with Mikkel. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. I have had many plans in the last year and many invitations, and they've all led to cancellation. So just being here is a victory in its own, I think. So thank you so much for joining us both here and online and so on. And what I'm interested in is really the question about how digital transformations have consequences for the way we organize, how organizations operate, but also this interest in questions about governance or the kind of politics that come out of those types of developments. So obviously that's a huge question, but what I want to do with the talk is really to sort of offer one way of approaching these questions through a focus on questions about transparency, questions about visibilities, and so on and so forth. So what I'll be drawing on is both the book that David was so kind to mention, called The Digital Prism, but also some work that I'm doing right now, forthcoming work that looks at the sort of politics of visibility. So I'll focus a little bit on questions about organizing and a little bit on questions about governance. So to just sort of situate this talk a little bit, I'll just say a few words about how I think about digital transformations. So I think the starting point is really that there was a point in time where it made sense to talk about digital technologies as a kind of cyberspace, a separate independent domain that we would enter and leave again. And increasingly, as you all know, these technologies are becoming a kind of backbone, a kind of infrastructure to so many parts of society. So we need to think differently about the role of digital technology. And obviously, this is both about sort of realizing that they give us access to information, they can help us distribute information, but also this development that we term datafication, that many parts of social life take a data form. So those are the kind of issues, or the kind of the background to what I'm talking about. More specifically, I'm interested in then the kinds of governance and organization that come out of these processes of digitalization and datafication. So one way to think about this is that we live in a different kind of society than before. We live in a society where visibility is a kind of default. We used to have to hunt for information, spend money and time on digging information out, searching for information, and so on. And that default has shifted into a kind of state of affairs where everything is more or less available all the time, and we need to have other kind of skills, hide things, take things out of sight, and so on and so forth. So those kind of changes that come with digital transformations is where I sort of situate my work. So what led me to do this work was really a sort of both an interest in transparency, but also a kind of, being puzzled about this phenomenon. Because in many ways, with digital transformation, we also have this sort of hope, at least, or this ideal about more information being available, more bad things not being able to hide, and so on and so forth. So this whole idea that with digital transformations, we would get much more transparency, we would, solve many of the problems that we had in the past, and so on. So one quote that captures this, obviously, is this idea of sunlight as a kind of disinfectant, and electric light as a kind of policeman that will help us solve societal problems because we can see more things, no one can hide, and so on and so forth. And under this kind of way of thinking about transparency, I think there's a kind of formula that says, if we just get more information, if we disclose more information, we will see things as they really are, and we can understand the world around us much better, and so on and so forth. And out of that will come more trust, better control, better kind of human conduct as a result. So that kind of formula, what I call a transparency formula, is what I seek to problematize in the book and also in this talk. To say, I think there's something else at stake, something more complex at work than simply this kind of formula that focuses on, the quality of information, the quantity of information, and has this idea that transparency is simply a matter of sort of opening up the window on reality, and then we see things as they really are, and so forth. So that kind of equation between, getting more information and solving societal problems is the starting point for this kind of thinking also. So instead of talking about transparency as this window we open on reality, in the book and in my work, I talk about the management of visibilities. So when we get digital transformations and processes of datafication, we also sort of propel processes of people, individuals, and organizations having to manage visibilities in many, many different ways. So, and this is why the book is called The Digital Prism. So instead of a metaphor that talks about windows, I talk about digital technologies as these prisms that refract realities and create new kind of phenomena and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in these developments that come with digital transformations that are about how we sort of see things in new ways, show things in particular ways, manage information, and also hide things in new ways, and so on and so forth. So that's what I mean. I think of this as a kind of starting point or analytic that offers one way to think about how digital technologies affect organizing and create new forms of governance and so on and so forth. So in some of my empirical work, I've then looked at different kind of organizational settings where questions about transparency seem to be at play and where digital technologies made things visible in new ways and so on and so forth. So obviously we can think about workplaces that are monitored and where different forms of surveillance take place. We can think about glass offices, the whole sort of spectacle around open offices and so on and so forth. Some of this work, empirical work I did for the book, was at Google and Facebook in Silicon Valley, where we have these kind of weekly meetings where everyone can ask questions to their bosses, and there's a sort of culture of openness and transparency that they really sort of pushed for, at least for a while. And also these questions about what happens to us as individuals when we start to think of ourselves not just as a sort of human piece of, a body of flesh and so on, but also a kind of digital twin or a digital double, as a kind of collection of digital traces that we also have to manage and navigate and make sure that if future employers or the public sector starts to make decisions about us based on those digital doubles, we have to nurture them and we have to manage what goes into them and so on and so forth. And then also, looking at, this is a picture from the German Pirate Party, one organization that really took this idea of transparency as a kind of starting point for its political ambitions and aspirations. There's a wonderful paper by Leopold Ringel in Organization Studies that looks at this. What happened, they had this idea, we want to make everything we do transparent to voters, to the world outside. So every meeting would be live streamed, everything would be available online and so on and so forth. And what happened obviously was that no other party wanted to collaborate with them, because you can't do politics if there are no private spaces where you negotiate and find a common ground and so on and so forth. So it just speaks to this point that these aspirations towards transparency create a particular kind of dynamic, and this is what I call the management of visibilities. All these decisions, all this work that goes into deciding what to share, what to hide, what to keep to yourself, and so on and so forth. But taking those types of ideas from the level of the organization into questions about governance is what I'll be focusing on right now. So what happens when processes of datafication enter this sphere where we do politics, where we try to sort of develop new forms of governance and so on and so forth. So some of my work has been to sort of articulate a vocabulary that captures the kind of processes that go into this kind of politics, that draws on data and tries to sort of shape the world through algorithms and other kinds of digital tools and so on and so forth. So questions about how we come to see phenomena through this digital prism, how we produce knowledge through these types of means, big data, algorithmic sorting, whatever, and also the kind of governance that then emerges from these types of efforts. So in the chapter I'm finishing right now for a book by Andrea Brigenzi talks about these coded visions, that out of these approaches or these ways of doing politics, we see some particular logics that are both technological but also political in a different manner. So 2 examples that I look at in the chapter, one is to look at the way we use data for purposes of prediction, such as in policing and other areas, security and so on, where there's a sort of tendency to take models developed for something like earthquakes and import them into police work and try and sort of treat crime as if it was an earthquake. So these kind of logics that travel with digital technologies and data-driven systems is really interesting, I think. Another empirical site that we look at is a tool that was developed to sort of prevent radicalization. And it works simply by picking up what people do online, and then if somebody is profiled as a possible, soon-to-be terrorist or radicalized person, that system will start feeding people other kinds of information to sort of give them a broader view of ISIS, give them a broader view of what it means to be a terrorist, and so on and so forth. So these types of approaches that really, and this particular system uses AdWords as a kind of starting point for thinking about how to treat people's activities online, and so on and so forth. So these kind of travels of logics from one domain to another is what I'm interested in. So I'm interested in the kind of visions or the kind of politics in a broad sense that come out of these phenomena. So to wrap up, I think of these as a particular kind of politics, a politics of visibility that draws on datafication and enacts particular forms of politics, and obviously do so by reproducing some ideas about the sort of objective and other kinds of features of these types of approaches that draw on data and algorithms and so on, but also create something new, create something that we haven't seen before, so to speak. So I'm interested in how different social phenomena enter what I term this digital prism, become sort of datafied and refracted and reorganized through these types of systems. And obviously also to think more broadly about the kind of political interventions and forms of politics and governance that come out of these ways of treating the social world. So I think this is valuable because it offers us a kind of a vocabulary for thinking about these phenomena that have to do with digital transformations, organizations, and politics. And drawing on Brigenzi again, I think visibility offers a kind of one lens to think about these issues. So this means we can think of the management of visibilities both as a kind of fundamental social phenomenon, but also a kind of analytical vocabulary that can help us understand some of these broad changes that I'm interested in. So I think I'll stop here, and I look forward to questions about, what does this mean also for social movements, or why don't we have social movements that engage in these types of issues, and so on and so forth. So thank you.
Okay, now we can go to the third panelist. We will collect the questions afterwards, and then I already have a few here in the chat. So those at home who feel like posing questions, don't refrain yourself, and you have the time, and keep on adding comments if you want to. So our third panelist is Marina Micheli. She will work on she will tell us and share with us the results of her project DigiTransScope. So thank you, Marina, as well, for being with us.
Good afternoon, and thank you really for the kind invitation to this great workshop. I am coming a bit from a different background, so I'm not coming from management study, but I really hope that my talk could bring a contribution to the debate. So you should be able to see my slide. Okay, so as it was anticipated, I will present work on data governance conducted within the exploratory research project called DigiTranscope, which run at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Sorry, of course. So the Joint Research Center, for those who do not know, is the science and knowledge service of the European Commission that is in charge of providing scientific evidence to support European policy. And the project investigated the emerging approaches for personal data sharing, control, and use put forward by different social actors beyond big tech. And it identified 4 alternative data governance models. I say alternative, but I could also say diverse, because the idea was that this model had to differ from the take it or leave it approach for handling personal data that is typical of big tech platforms. And they do so granting more decision-making power to a broader range of actors. So this work was moved by 2 main goals. Develop an heuristic tool to examine data practices through a social science-informed perspective that I will explain in a bit, and contribute informing European data policy, promoting for a fairer data economy, so addressing this data asymmetry. So the work starts from the premises that a wide variety of imbalances exist when it comes to accessing data, but also in the ability to derive meaningful information and insights from it. So this has been called the big data divide, for instance. In particular, it's being said that data subjects have lost control of their personal data. So they generate massive amount of digital footprint, but this information is mostly and mainly used by data holders' company to further generate profit. And so the potential of such data to create social value remains mostly untapped. So these relate to the debate on secondary use of data, such as the use of data collected by commercial companies for the public good. So like, for instance, the use of GPS location data for crisis response or urban planning and so on. So basically, in this context, we asked, to what extent current data asymmetry are tackled by these different or alternative models of data governance that are more inclusive and that produce different kinds of value. To do so, we proposed a social science informed definition of data governance. So such definition emphasizes the power relation between the actors that are involved in the way that data is handled or that are affected by it. So it also emphasizes the kind of value that is produced and how such value is redistributed among the actors. And also it accounts for the socio-technical arrangements that sustain certain approaches. And these socio-technical arrangements include the underlying principle and also system of thoughts that are at the heart of this model. So basically, we understand data governance not as data management, not as data protection or regulation, but mainly as the decision made over data, who is able to make such decision over data and to influence the way data is accessed and benefited from. So we see data governance as the result of a process that develops also from the practices of the various actors, from the interaction, cooperation, negotiation between the various stakeholders for controlling data. So the models that I'm going to describe in a bit that are emerging from such practices of such social actors are of course embedded in certain economic and regulatory settings, but at the same time, they might shape future regulation and future digital economy. So the definition draws from science and technology studies and critical data studies, and in particular from 2 concepts that allow to investigate the power dimension within complex socio-technical arrangements. So one is that of data infrastructure, so the idea that each data governance model is a socio-technical ecosystem with a plurality of actors with multiple agendas interacting with an array of tools, mechanisms, values, and systems. And the other one is that of data politics, which is the notion of the new power relations that are generated in the process for accessing, controlling, and using data, especially also looking at that towards data subjects. So in 2018 and early 19, we did a review of relevant documents from both the scientific and the gray literature that imagined or described alternative practices for data governance. And we identify 4 emerging models. But such models that we describe in the paper are ideal types. So basically they are abstract conceptualization that emphasize certain traits in order to synthesize the phenomenon that in reality differ for the degree of affiliation to those traits. So they do not claim to offer the exhaustive and final pictures of all possible models out there, but they wish to provide a basis to understand how the emerging models are redressing power asymmetries between big data platforms and other actors. So I will now give a high-level overview of these models before moving to the conclusion and the main takeaway from this study. So data sharing pools are, what we define data sharing pools are horizontal joint initiative among 2 or more data holder organizations that could be both private and public that establish partnerships for sharing, aggregate, and analyze each other data. In that case, the goal is the distribution of the economic benefits among all the partners involved. But even if data sharing pools are the most widespread among the models that we have found, they have important limitations that have to be highlighted. First of all, data holders that possess more valuable data sets might have, of course, greater power to set the terms for how data is accessed and used, and might use data sharing pool to actually conservate a monopolistic position. On the other hand, data subjects do not have a say in this model because they are described mainly as recipients of the innovation that are developed, the data-driven innovation that emerge from such data sharing pools. And one of the main underlying principle of such a model is that the idea that data is a market commodity. So data is exchanged with the main goal of filling knowledge gaps and creating more profit for data holders. Basically, the idea that more data means more value. So it's not very different from the idea that is based on platform capitalism that we know. On the other hand, we have data cooperatives, which have been a bit mentioned before, which are grassroots-driven, decentralized organizations in which members of a certain community a community that could be online or on a certain location, voluntarily pool their data together, and this data can be used following the rules that members have approved. So data cooperatives wish to foster democratic control over data and an equitable share of the benefits that are produced. So they are aimed at generating benefits from the members of certain community. For instance, if we think at health data cooperatives, but at the same time, they foster public interest and social change, for instance, health research or workers' rights. So there is, of course, high interest at the moment on this model, but we have to say that they are mostly niche initiatives with limited uptake. For instance, because they rely only on data altruism, but they do not have public sustain or incentives. So it's very difficult for this to scale up because of the low uptake, and also in terms of keeping democratic engagement for all members. The underlying principle stems from the tradition of the cooperative movement, but also from the recent platforms cooperativism. So the cooperative movement promotes fair condition of value production in a non-monopolistic and democratic setting. So what does it mean? That data co-op explicitly aim to provide an alternative to the extractivist model of platform capitalism. The third model that we call public data trust is when a public actor, usually such as a local administration, establish a relationship of trust with citizens and manages data on their behalf. So a public actor assumes the role of a trustee and guarantee that citizen data is handled ethically and securely while enabling the reuse of data for the public interest. The main limitation or challenges of this model is that at the time this is mostly a conceptual model, and there are very few projects that are putting this in place in total as it's described in these ideal types. And it requires indeed putting in place trust-building governance mechanisms such as citizen consultation or independent data stewardship, and also the data awareness among citizens and among public bodies is limited, as well as data culture for putting in place such models. The underlying principle of public data trust is that data with a public interest component, such as data that is collected as a byproduct of utilities consumption or while moving on public transportation, is part of a public infrastructure. And so the information it affords should produce value for citizen and society. As the work from Morals of Embria that was put in the introduction is very seminal in this regard. And then the last model that we described is that of what we call personal data sovereignty, which is a model in which data subjects individually regain control of their personal data through ad hoc digital services. So a key mechanism for this model is the existence of an ecosystem of personal data spaces that are intermediary digital services that citizens can choose for storing their personal data or aggregating data that is disseminated on different platforms, and also control data sharing with third parties and exchange data for research. So personal data sovereignty empower individual citizens by improving their ability to make choice about their data, and at the same time foster economic growth through new commercial digital services. And the main limitation of this model that we found is that the personal data spaces, which are in the end business entities, might have interest in, and in a way might be interested in nudging user so to reach a bigger position in the market and take advantage of a network effect. And also, on the other hand, the majority of citizens at the current time would not have the skills nor the interest to take advantage of the opportunity offered by such services. And a key underlying principle is that of technological sovereignty intended as reducing the influence of big tech and states in the control of technology, but in this case applied to the level of the individual user. So from our analysis, we have identified and described 4 emerging models, which in a different way foster more inclusive forms of data governance that differ from the dominant one of big tech platforms. But thanks to the social science informed understanding of data governance, the typology that we found brings to the surface key difference among the models beyond apparent similarities. And first of all, 3 out of 4 models involve data subjects, which is of course an important step for a more democratic data regime, but is not certainly enough and has very different implications. In fact, although the 3 other models are all based on the idea of having a trusted data intermediary that gives more power to data subjects, they have very different dynamics, because such trusted data intermediary could be a cooperative that allows to keep democratic control over data and produce benefit for community and society, a public body which is entrusted by citizens to use their data ethically and for the public interest, or a commercial service that is chosen from an ecosystem of similar services that compete on the market. So we would say that the same notion, or maybe buzzword, is sometimes used to refer to data practices that are associated to very different models. So these underline how important it is to think critically about data governance as socio-technical system with certain power relations. Moving to the conclusion, so we think that various social actors are indeed conceptualizing or developing new approaches for data governance that redress the asymmetry of power of the dominant model. But most of these are in their early stages or niche initiatives or pilot projects, as we have said. There is no one-size-fits-all data governance models to be recommended or promoted for an equitable data landscape, but probably a combination of these models should be promoted. However, the results shows that the involvement, of course, of civil society and public bodies as key actors is important for promoting models that are truly alternative in terms of power relation and value production. So their role in data governance should be supported to avoid that market forces determine who have a say on how data is used and accessed. So finally, a social science perspective of data governance is useful in our view to uncover the power relation and detect differences in emerging alternative or simply emerging governance models. So ultimately, we hope that the typology presented in the paper could be an heuristic device for scholars and policymakers to design empirical research or develop theoretical commentaries that address the issues of data power and that sustain the development of more desirable future for our data economy. So thank you. Thank you for listening.
The speakers. Okay, we have some 25 minutes for questions. I have a couple of comments in the chat, but perhaps here in the auditorium, someone wants to intervene or raise a comment. If I may, I will start with trying to make a link between the first and the second session. There was an author that appeared in the two sessions, which is right on the utopian, real utopias. It was addressed as well by Marina in her last presentation, but and she identified one of the crucial problems that I think everyone working on the digital sphere realizes, the problem of power asymmetries, let me put it like this. So if we want to highlight the possibilities for alternative forms of organizing, what is, in all this spectrum of possibilities, forms of organizing, where do you see a specific light of hope? For instance, in the case of Marina, probably you will highlight that some of these, in this model that you have shared with us, you see a ray of hope in this direction or in another one. In your presentation, Mikkel, perhaps you gave more a critical tone about appropriation of data, potential for surveillance, tracking, profiling. This is open for the three of you. Where do you see the rays of hope for organizing differently and confronting this power imbalance? Yeah, Ali, please.
Yes, happy to go first. I mean, I guess where's the hope? I mean, I guess technology obviously has its affordances, its implications, but then obviously the power dynamics depend on all of us. And so I guess my hope, let me give you two reasons of hope. Is one is I think that there are more and more people who care, obtain expertise. That's one thing, right? And I mean, you see new programs popping up on technology, on AI and ethics, on AI and responsibility, AI and society. So there's more and more capacity building, which gives me hope. And the other one is, I think, a caring, right? I mean, a deep caring for these topics. So, I mean, technology is not neutral in itself, but if there are people who care, and I think scholars who care, I think that gives me also hope that we can use the transformative potential to its advantage and not disadvantage.
I see some hope, certainly. I think some of the ways in which we are sort of starting to lift the fog or the veil that surrounded digital transformations and digital technologies for so long, that they were forces of democracy, they were forces of expression, they were the kind of solutions to our problems, and that veil has sort of been lifted in the sense that we are realizing that our data is being harvested not for purposes of solving our societal problems, but for selling ads. So that, those basic kind of realizations, I think are important. And it's not just about some companies, big tech companies, it's really about a business model that is starting to surface as something that we can regulate and we can talk about and maybe down the road get rid of. So I think that creates some kind of hope. I think also, as the last presentation was about, new ways of thinking about data as a resource, not for selling ads, but for, bringing people together, solving problems, and so on and so forth. And I'm curious to know if there are sort of even bigger initiatives that could be done in this area, institutional developments that would help us make data work and serve these purposes. And also, I think even bigger public infrastructures that would sort of take some of the insights that we have now gained about problematic business models and ways of working with data and put those into infrastructures that would have some degree of data governance possibilities, some degree of privacy by design, and so on and so forth. So I think, there are all these little developments in so many different contexts, from the European Commission to national governments to small cooperatives, so many people starting to say, we want digital technologies. No society has developed without technology, but we want to talk about the terms and conditions that technology comes with.
Thank you. I don't know if Marina, you want to say something?
Yes, well, I agree with what has been said. And as I think you understand from my presentation, I think that, I hear echo, okay. Well, the involvement of public bodies and communities and civil society at the same time, it's probably the key strategy for actually enabling these new forms of data governance. And as it was said before, yes, some mistakes have been understood, but I think there is still much to learn concerning technological solutionism and the problem behind this. And so this was also one attempt from our work. But again, also in this case, I think there is very much more awareness, both in scholarship and it's beginning also among policymakers for sure, especially in Europe, and also at the civic level. And I think also the debate that concerned, for instance, the release of contact tracing apps was very interesting, especially in Europe. It was interesting to see the movement of privacy activists and other kind of activists to problematize the solutionism thinking that there was behind the idea of developing such app and the risk that were associated to it. So, and I think this kind of debate, public debate, informed also some recommendations that were then released by the European Commission. So there is, in that case, there is definitely hope, but there is a lot to do still, I think.
I think at least the first one by Elke Schussler, I think it was related to your presentation, Ali, on what did you mean by data that has not yet happened, and how to use historical counterfactuals to develop future scenarios. I don't know if I fully understand it, but how to think forecasting. Once you talk about these attempts, how to theorize the change brought about by technology. Yeah, going deeper into this counterfactual and forecasting.
I'm happy to respond to that, and I think it's maybe the most contentious part, or scholar from my presentation and also from Viviane in my paper. Let me maybe give you 3 brief examples of what this means. If you think about Corona, there are many scholars, including myself, who have published articles about Corona after it had happened, right? And what we need is, though, oh, this is my son coming in. We organize in different ways, families who come together here. 3 families in one home. So Corona, before Corona, like how could you do research ex ante, right? And you couldn't because it didn't exist, because you didn't have empirical data. And this would mean that we could imagine these things before they happen. That's one example. Another example would be AI singularity, right? Could we not think about AI singularity before it happens and theorize that? Independent of whether this will become true or not, but then we have our theories ready if it happens, right? And a third example, I mentioned the Martin Luther King speech. Another example would be, what about a gender equal or racist free society or organizing? Now, if it doesn't exist, what if we imagine a racist-free organizing, for instance, to exist and theorize what that means before it exists? And this is what it would mean. It would be to theorize what does not yet exist, to develop theories that equip us if it happens, so Corona, or it gives us a foresight towards what we would want to do, and then kind of shadow backwards to get there.
Okay, thank you, Ali. We have a couple of questions, 3 questions, not 4. Well, that's fantastic. We've gone from 0 to 4. So we start with Maya, please.
Thank you all. Very interesting presentations, very timely and relevant topic. As an educator in this space, I teach students in business analytics, and I teach them about data governance, and we talk about the problems that lie in this field that you've pointed out. And in addressing these, I wanted to hear your take on what's the balance, what do you think about different approaches and their feasibility? And I think about the approach of targeting the suppliers, right? The big tech, the suppliers of the data governance that as we know it. There's been talk about regulation, breaking them up, et cetera, but also about the education of the demand side, right? The users. And we know from research that people get hooked on false news because they elicit surprise and anger and tickle curiosity and speak in a way to very human tendencies that don't necessarily bring out the best in the media landscape as we've seen it. And so I was wondering, how could we foster these alternative models of data governance that you, Marina, talked about, or how should we address the supply and the demand side, and what would be sort of promising ways forward that would sort of lighten up these rays of hope that David has already mentioned? Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is a general question for any of you. Anyone who wants to give it a shot? Not an easy one. So I think we can approach the same question with the other supply and demand. So how should we educate the citizens as well? Perhaps, I mean, not that much focusing on big tech, but can we do something as scholars and educators regarding the citizen and how the individual should react against these threats, challenges that we have identified?
Well, of course, as I said, for most of these models to be successful is indeed a key that citizens are able to use these tools for data governance and have a reason to do so, and the skills, the time. So there is much work to do in terms of data culture and data awareness. It can be for sure done through education, but also at the level of public institution, because when we mention the idea of public data trust, of this kind of innovative data-driven service at the level of, for instance, local level or the city level, we have also to imagine how different cities face this, and the fact that not all cities and local administration have the same economic and human resources to engage, and as well as data literacy and data culture. So basically what I want to say is that, of course, the inequality that are in society are very much reflected in the way that all these models can be successful. So in a way, the point of studying data power and also inequality in relation to data access and ability to use data is very much important to also somehow minimize the hype that is sometimes beyond such models, which have to be, I think, promoted as in the spirit of this conference, to think of alternatives, but at the same time, it's important to ground these alternatives in the limitation and societal limits that they face. I don't know if that's clear, but I think these are two levels that have to be stressed by scholars in this field. Yes.
One starting point for dealing with some of these issues is really that we back up a little bit and look at the digital domain as in the same manner as we look at other kind of industries. So a kind of normalization of both the way we regulate these companies and also among customers and consumers or users, a kind of normalization that, yes, of course you can contact a company, even if it's not a company that sells you something, but you have some kind of a relationship with through your data. So there are all these kind of strange solutions in the digital domain that we don't accept in other contexts, like signing up for a bank and never being able to take your money out of that bank again, for instance. I mean, signing up for Facebook and never being able to take your data out again. Those types of strange solutions are something that we need to address and normalize, I think. Or other strange things like that you cannot write from one social media platform to the other. We would not accept this for mobile phones, that you could only call people with an iPhone through an iPhone, or only call the people who had the same service as you on your phone, and so on and so forth. So there are all these strange things that can be addressed at the level of regulation through interoperability, data portability, all these types of regulatory tools that are not about breaking up companies necessarily, but simply installing some sort of normal expectations about how they operate and so forth.
Okay, I think I have 4 questions. I don't know if this is feasible. I will ask you, to one after the other. I will try to collect the 4 questions, but if you can do it, we will start with you, Liliana. If you want, very brief. If you can address it to a person, then it's even better. Then Obaid, Marco. Oh.
I think it's her. Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you. I have a comment and a question, but I will be very brief. So my comment is that maybe we can think about different schemes like around data, and data as a common good, like at Citra Fund, they are kind of testing in Finland, and they are kind of pushing forward a fair data economy based on something that Mikkel was mentioning, which is more data. It doesn't necessarily mean better social provision, and that's one of the comment. And my question is more about methods as a researcher, because I have the feeling that we have in a paradox. We're living a paradox. Like apparently we live in a transparent world, but as a social scientist, maybe we are not equipped with the tools to understand what's going on. So I would like to hear, particularly Ali was mentioning this, and Mikkel to some extent, how are you facing this in terms of research methods and so on? Because many things are at stake in terms of social processes, and maybe we don't have the tools developed enough in order to understand what's going on.
This will go for Ali then?
For okay. Ali and Mikkel.
Mikkel,
well, okay. Ali then.
Obaid now, please, very succinct there.
Thank you very much. So my question is actually to Mikkel and Marina. Just given some of the insights that you had, I believe what's becoming more visible is our own activities. Meanwhile, some of the digital platforms are operating more in the dark, right? Given the kind of mechanisms we've talked about, is the individual capable of managing their own data? The amount of, for example, the concept of light. We only have 2 eyes, so if you shine too much light, we wouldn't be able to see anything. And it seems like that's what's happening with the information, right? It's available, but it's not really accessible. We're not able to process it. So if is the individual capable, or are they going to get overburdened? And if not, then what are the alternative mechanisms we need to see? And if it's government, then how do we address the cozy relationship between the platforms and the governments themselves in terms of accessing data?
This one will go for Marina, then I understand? Okay, Ali, sorry, the 4, we will try to do it under 5 minutes, I think.
Thank you very much. This is mostly for Professor Mikkel. You mentioned how digital transparency allows us to see things as they are and allows us to tackle some of the societal problems. But aside from the not so novel paradox of like when radicals are censored, they go underground, we are seeing net neutrality being compromised through governmental regulation, being able to get social media platforms to suppress the opposition in the name of radicalization. So what are your thoughts on this? When you've seen this with many right-wing governments, such as the Modi government in India and Netanyahu's government in Israel?
This is for Mikkel then.
Yeah.
Okay, and the last one for Marco.
For Marina, thank you for your presentation. And you used in different moments in your presentation the notion of value, no? Value generation, value distribution, which is a critical point. I'm going to talk about open source in the last section. And so I know how difficult it is to measure, identify the generation and the distribution of value in the digital environments. And in the data, is happening something very similar to what we observed in the open source. No? That, for example, most of the transactions are not mediated by monetary transactions. That is the basic way we use to measure value. And another typical aspect of the data that is also common to the open source is that most of the value is generated through the sharing. Now, more we share, more value is generated. You know? And it is completely different, even opposite to the typical forms of realizing value through the markets. No? So these are very challenging issues that we have to address. And I wonder if you have thought about this, or if you have seen something which is interesting about how to address these issues.
Okay, so now you basically have 1 minute, each of you, to try to, well, give your thoughts on the questions that were here. Can we start with you, Ali, since you were?
Yeah, sure. Let me just say it's wonderful that we have 1,500 scholars, 3 kids, and 1 cat present. I can see a cat on Marina's screen, so that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, 1 minute, 3 questions, because there were also 2 questions in the chat. So the question from the podium or from the audience was on the technological skills and then the necessity to require these skills or acquire them. I mean, in the EMR piece, we talk about contextual expertise and that we need, as a scholarly community, to develop these skills, right? That means that not each of us individually has these skills, but as a community, we need to think who to recruit, how to work in research teams, and how to build institutions. So at the Humboldt Institute, for instance, we have IT experts, lawyers, we have social scientists coming together on these topics, because digitalization is really a topic which crosses all these disciplines. And I think we need to build new institutions. One side note, we once taught a program in Oxford on entrepreneurial leadership in universities, and there's a university in the USA where they are spatially organized around problems rather than departments. 2 sentences to the questions in the chat by Elke. So it's not forecasting or scenario planning, because these really focus on probable futures. What we care about is desirable futures that might actually be not probable or not likely, but that we could develop to make them more likely. And then the question by Andreas about the AMR piece by Corona et al. That is a really good piece. I mean, one could argue philosophically whether that's a tautological argument and whether it's actually impossible to have anything novel in the world if one follows their argument, right, about what is novel. I mean, the way we do it in the piece with Michael Smets in RSO, we call novelty something which is amic, not attic. So it doesn't matter whether it is, and their argument would be there's nothing novel in principle or a priori. We would say there is something novel if it's perceived as novel. And I think that's different, but from a social science perspective, I think perceived novelty has an impact on how organizations and people enact that novelty. So I guess it's a complementary argument to the one by Purnam and al. And I hope this was 1 minute.
Thank you, Ali. Marina, now you want to...
So thank you. Regarding the question on the individual, as I said before, I think individuals at the moment are not really capable of adopting these, let's say, digital services for the management of data. And most of all, I think the solution should not be on the individual level. So that's why the presentation focused on this idea of trusted data intermediaries, and also to look critically at these trusted data intermediaries to better understand what are their goals and what kind of relation they establish at the end when they are implemented. And I think that public bodies will definitely have a role, but that there is increasing discussion on how to make them more trustworthy. And so the establishment of citizen consultation, living labs, or independent data stewardships, so that is not the public body itself, but it goes through a non-profit organization. So there are a series of mechanisms that public bodies have to put in place to act as an intermediary for enabling these data governance models. And the other question about value, thank you, and I was expecting some question on this regard from this conference. And what I can say is that, of course, thanks a lot for your specification. And the point of this paper was not really to measure value, but to have a normative understanding of value. So to look at what other kinds of value besides economic value are looked for in these models. So so probably that's a different angle, but I'm happy to discuss more if you get in touch. Thank you.
We are over time, but 1 minute for you. Right, thank you. So thank you for your questions. I think I'll address the one that speaks about how to solve some of these problems surrounding data and so on. And I think it's interesting to see that these, in the end, are not really technological questions. They are really questions about individual competencies, responsibilities, and then they're, I think, institutional questions. So on one hand, I don't think it's a good idea that individuals should be in charge of handling their own data. I don't think we should sort of individualize the responsibility for these things. But on the other hand, we've seen something like the iOS update that asked users, do you want this app to track you or not? 95% in the US said no, thank you. Just so phrasing questions in such a simple manner is one way, I think, to activate a kind of personal responsibility. But for the rest, I think a lot of it has to be institutional. It has to be, different kinds of societal institutions that take on this challenge and try and address that problem. So I think that's a minute.
Okay, so thanks a lot. We went over time 1 minute, but
well done.
Yep. Thanks again for being with us. So thank you, Marina, Ali, Mikel, and I see you in 8 minutes with this third session. See you now.
Thanks a lot.
Everyone, we are in the third session of today. And basically in the two previous sessions, we have been theorizing about moral markets and secondly on different shapes of data governance and so on. But in this session, which is the last of this afternoon, we are going to get into practice. And basically here I will introduce you my colleagues here, but basically what we are going to do now is to go to this commons-based approach under the practitioner perspective and experience. So here on my left, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Ramon Roca, who is the president and co-founder of the Gifinet Foundation, which, as far as we know, it's a grassroots project with the objective to offer an open and free telecom infrastructure. We will learn more about this in a minute. And at the other side of Ramon, we have Marco Berlinguer, who has a PhD in public policy and social transformation. And he is also currently teaching at the IGOP from the Autonomous University of Barcelona and the SCAC University. So welcome to this session. I have to say that we have a kind of a challenge because we have 40 minutes, 2 brilliant speakers, and I'm sure that many questions will be arisen. So I'm not going to say anything else, and I just pass the floor to to Marco Berlinguer, who is going to share with us his perspective about how have we moved from a social movement to a new mode of production, and you will illustrate us about the open source movement. So thank you, Marco. The floor is yours.
What I have to do now?
Wrong.
The green one, yes.
No, but this is my presentation.
No.
This is your presentation. So sorry, maybe we can ask to switch the presentation to Marco's presentation. Yes, now it's coming.
Okay.
So now we don't have the challenge of the hybrid, panel, but we have the challenge of the wrong slide. So everything's ready now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk about the open source software, which is a very interesting experience, in my opinion, and which allows us to reflect about the role that social movements can have in innovation, and also is the pioneer in a way. The free and open source software has been the pioneer in the rediscovery of the commons on the frontiers of the digital revolution. So the free and open source software is, I would say, the most mature manifestation, a concretization of what Elinor Ostrom called the new commons at the end of her life, which are quite different from the traditional commons that she studied. And also, I would say, it's important to reflect about the fact that the software is the core technology and the core industry of the digital revolution. So we are talking about something that is at the core of the general transformation of our society, no? And to see the evolution of this phenomenon in this industry is quite interesting. Moreover, we can say that the inventions, the innovations that the free and open source software introduced at different levels have been emulated in many other domains. So this is another, if you like, manifestation, proof of the significance of this experience and of this trajectory, because it has spread in contents, networks, we will see, hardware and data. I would say that in this moment, what's happening in hardware and data is extremely important in terms of adoption of models that mutatis mutandis can be considered as an expansion of these innovations. So the free and open source software was born as a social movement in all its characteristics, and was born at the margins of the industry, at the margins of the institutional life, And progressively, it grew interstitially, and it's now, we can say, without doubt, at the center of this fundamental technology and this fundamental industry, which is software. And in each step that the software, the open source software lived through, it has been a source of innovation. So this is also interesting to remark. The beginning go back to the 80s and especially in the 90s. And the first concretizations of this experience were informal communities, which invented and laid down the basic innovations that still characterize the forms of producing software, which then, as we will see, has spread and has penetrated in all the software industry. Still, we have the communities, which were not the original source of these innovations, are still very, very important in the software and in the open source ecosystem. Apache Foundation is a good example of a big foundation that still maintains the spirit of the original communities. But nevertheless, what happened, I would say, since the middle of the 2000s, the first decade of 2000s, is that the last decade has been marked more than by the communities, by the adoption of this model of production and innovation by the industry. So it's quite surprising, if we like, because, for example, one of the characteristics that is intrinsic to the fact that this is a commons is that it cannot be commercialized directly. A software which is based on the license that are typical of the free and open source software. So it was surprising to see how it spread progressively. But if you look now, for example, I give you some example of the situation we observe now in this ecosystem. If you look at the membership of the Linux Foundation, which is the most important institution, if you like, that was born within this trajectory, you find all the tech industry of the world as part of the foundation. But also it's extremely significant the complete turn that Microsoft was obliged to do in relationship with the open source because of this progressive expansion and dominance that the open source gained on all the frontiers of the digital innovations. Especially the cloud computing was very important in this understanding of Microsoft that it had to change completely its policies. No? Microsoft has been the arch-enemy of the open source and the free software for long. And there are various models that we can observe about how companies and new forms of generating market and of capitalistic competition have been able, in a way, to absorb these challenging characteristics that have the open source. No? This is the original form, which is about selling services on the top of the open source. This is even more interesting, which is the progressive capacity that the companies learn about cooperating in building together. There are, for example, in this case, hundreds, even thousands of companies which collaborate in creating what we can call common infrastructures. And this is another model that was introduced in a way by Google's with Android, now, which is a strategy through the introduction of an open source solution, an open source platform, of a strategy for reorganizing an entire sector of production and an entire ecosystem. No? So it's about competitive strategies that now are routinely used in many areas. For example, here you have several cases, examples in the artificial intelligence. So also in this second stage, which is about the absorption of this model into the market, we can observe many important innovations that were driven by this phenomenon. Probably the most important are about these new forms of capitalism that have emerged, and in general, the existence of models which are hybrids, where we see, in a way, managed in different configurations, the idiosyncrasy that exists between a commons and a market, but also the potential synergies that can exist between these two different models of organizing the property, the governance, and the generation of value. So, to arrive to today, my understanding, but I think is corroborated by evidence, many evidences, is that the next stage, we are still, in a way, in a process of evolution of this phenomenon. For this reason, I was saying in the making, in the title, because we have to consider these phenomena as still evolving, and the next stage, in my opinion, is going to be characterized by the entrance in force of the public actor in this ecosystem. There are many signs, of course, not just in the open source, of this politicization of the next stage of the digital transformation, but when you enter at this stage in the digital policy, you meet naturally open source, and this is what's happening. There are various reasons behind this increased importance of the public intervention, which is not limited to the digital sphere. But also I would say that it's not new, and as it has been in the past, the open source is going to necessarily to provoke and to push for innovations in the public policy. And these innovations are absolutely necessary because, as I was saying, it's not new, the attempt by public actors, public policies at different levels of endorsing, supporting, and trying to take advantage of the potentiality of the open source. But we don't have any good model up to now about this policy. So innovations are extremely necessary for this new stage, and we will see probably emerging a new generation of public policy around the attempt to exploit the potential of open source, and around the attempt to intervene in a new way of the public actors in the digital policy. These are three areas which I've been studying the public policy applied to the open source for a couple of years between 2018 and 2019. And these were now, for me, emerging areas for innovative public policies, which then, afterward, the publication of this essay, have been concretized, especially at the European level union. Here you have a collection of initiatives which took place in the European context in the last 1 year and a half, more or less. You have a declaration of the Council of the European Union. You have Gaia X, which is one of the most interesting initiatives, which has been generated initially by the Ministry of Economy of Germany, and many others, which go exactly in the direction that I'm talking about. But also, another very interesting evolution is happening, for example, in China. China is adopting a very ambitious policy of adoption of open source at the maximum level of government. And so we are going to see in the next stage the open source becoming a central element of the ongoing competition that is taking place for the hegemony in the technological, economical, and geopolitical future of our societies. And these are probably three elements which are going to characterize this third stage from the three capabilities, three fundamental capabilities that are going to decide about who is going to win, in a way, the struggle for the hegemony of this new stage of development of this process, which is about creating coalitions of state, communities, and productive ecosystems, capacity of leadership in collaborative production and innovation, and a capacity of orchestration of multi-level and mixed in terms of combining markets, state, and commons mechanisms in the forms of governance and in the forms of wealth generation.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you for being so strict with the timing. And I think that you have put on the table some sources of hope that David was before asking. And now we're moving from software to hardware, because Ramon comes from Gifinet, as I said before, and his experience is more on the infrastructure level and how to provide this common infrastructure, and his speech is about internet access through shared infrastructures as in commons. So Ramon, the floor is yours.
Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here, to hear Marco before, in particular when talking, and also about data and the other workshops, our sessions. And quite often I feel very jealous when hearing people about open data, open source, and so on, because when we are switching to infrastructure, I mean, we are very much the hippie that Balmer was mentioning about Microsoft, at the time that they were very against I mean, we're going like in the other way that the things are going. It's quite often very difficult for us to explain how to apply, and hopefully that's what I'm going to try, my humble contribution to the audience. I'm an activist. I'm not from the academia. Sorry for that, but what's happening in the real world, we're trying to apply the commons and why we do, and how it's needed to succeed, which is not easy. In particular, when you are very much against the mainstream practices that are happening, and everybody is saying that we are the hippies. How was the hippie GPLs, which is contaminating everything. And at the end of the day, and that's the only theory image that I'm using. I know very much of all of you already saw this iconography about the evolution. I know in the very last stage, these two stages, actually, it happened only with 15, 20 years of difference. So it's going very fast. And we're evolution, and we got into computers, and now into this kind of, flat screens that we have everyone in our pockets. And it went very deeply in our lives. And actually, this is the 21st century. I mean, and realize or not, the problem is that, and that's just a general thought, that's why it's important. It's already said that United Nations declared internet access as a human right? If you don't have internet access, then you don't have access to education or to many other rights, or even healthcare or whatever. The pandemic was very clear in that. I mean, the connected and unconnected can make a very big difference. So we have to be concerned on how important it is to really connect everyone, because there is still many people not connected. So, and I'm hearing quite often we have 80% of the people with broadband access and so on, and we are talking about human rights. Will be unacceptable that having only 80% people having education, and what about the other 20? And what about the other 25 in the 80% of the territory? So is that dramatic? Let's say, and the pandemic really showed that again, because if 80% of the territory doesn't have the same opportunities than the other 20, right? And it's not acceptable. We have to look in the other way. If we have 15% or just 5% of people without internet, then it is required to connect everyone, because we cannot accept 5% people not having access to public health or to education. It will have to be 100% with the same opportunities. If we don't reach that, then we are in a big trouble, because we are creating discrimination. And when you're looking to the picture and to the problem, try to connect everyone or everything from the mountains. That is what I'm trying to explain in that diagram. In the top, we put the top. The top is connecting the people. The rest is in the bottom, right? That's why we inverted the iconography, and it has to reach the mountain zones from the suburbs, from the industry. So it's about connecting everyone, and that's typically in the telecoms they say this the last mile, right? It's well known, the last mile, and it's the only thing that we are missing. Provide the last mile to everywhere with the same. There are many technologies, but the same options and everything. That's it. The other is already there. I mean, not far from any point across all the planet. We have fiber optics on the high power lines, in the railways, in the roads, in the submarine cables. Doesn't matter if you are talking about global south or global north. Satellites, of course, are everywhere also. And so that and interconnection as well is happening everywhere. So the only thing that we have to do is doing the last mile, which is very much the costly thing. And the problem of, and that's my case, this is my house. And in the winter, not in this, it is in the mountains, not in the mountains, in the Pre-Pyrenees, not far from here, about 1 hour and something driving, so it's not a big distance. And what happens is that I'm not living in, of course, I'm living in a municipality. There's an administrative district there, but there is no streets. I'm living in a rural area, but in a farm without the streets, without nothing else. And you know that we're said, if you go, for instance, 18 years ago was very much, we started doing radio links for getting connected at those places. Because at that time we were hearing, you know, the government spending lots of millions of euros for giving subsidized to companies to provide access to rural areas. But we were still unconnected at that time. Although that money was already spent, right? And so we have to find lives for getting connected. And so we started doing radio links. And in 2009, it is 12 years from now, we did the same with fiber optics. So now, and we did because, I mean, they were saying in those programs, and still in many cases, and still Europe is feeding and inundating with billions of euros to the big companies for dealing with that, right? And fighting the digital divide. And reality is that, okay, for living in a place like there, you need, in the 20th century, you need electricity and water to take a shower or whatever. And in the 21st century, you need also internet for accessing to the rest of that's the only difference. So you have to need everything. And also, I moved from, in terms of electricity for the carbon print and so on, trying to move to carbon zero. So I know how much it costs to connect. And it costs 20 times more expensive to have drinkable water or something to get showered. If you don't get connected to the line, then you have to build your own hole in the floor and then sanitize the water and everything. And if you want to install solar panels and so on, and it is profitable, it takes 8 to 10 years, and then you get a return. And fiber, with fiber, which is the best, which, by the way, was said that it is not profitable to connect those areas, and we very much trusted that version from the market and the sector. It's not profitable, and so it was 10 to 20 times cheaper to get connected with fiber optics in a place like this, because fiber is much cheaper than copper, right? That's the reality. So, thinking on to make it, in a common sense, it is possible. But we have to do in a way that it's not connecting myself. If I'm using, and it's not because of vision or political principles or whatever. It's about practical sense. If I have to go from the city to install an antenna and trying to connect there, I have to trespass. There is something in between that I need to cooperate. So it has to be done in a community approach, right? And if I am throwing a cable and coming from the city to reach my home, it will be ridiculous to do it just by myself. I mean, I will connect everything in between, because it has then is when the cost goes down, and it costs just 10 times cheaper than, because the same cable can connect everyone and provide electricity. So it's for nothing else but common sense. Then we do that in a commons for practical sense, and it works. And when we have done, you realize that on the beginning was said that was not profitable for the companies. Okay, so what's not profitable for an agriculture means that when you are harvesting the fields, it means that you don't get paid for paying the gas of the tractor. That's when you are going in losses. But then, I mean, if we do, and we are even saving, comparing in what I was paying, so I saved money just for getting connected with fiber and keeping that fiber in commons. And we keep that fiber in commons because if we leave that fiber to the municipality, for instance, because we want to make it public, right? 10 years ago, you remember, very likely they are going to privatize the fiber and sell it to a private company. So we had to make some kind of form to ensure that that fiber will be as a public and a commons good, right? And that's it. So we did for common sense, practical, and it worked. And the total cost of ownership demonstrates that it's very much the best option for doing that, not for nothing else. And that's it. But the reality in the sector is very much different, and that's when the problem starts. Is that in telecoms, if you think twice, I mean. We can be the hippies, but I think at least we have common sense. But really what is not common sense is what happened here in the cities or not only in Barcelona. If you go to even the small, medium villages across Catalonia, you will see there are several fiber optics in those urban areas and not maybe in other places in the empty at Spain. So one people have several infrastructures in place and others don't have nothing. And that's the reality. And why it happened? Because only a single infrastructure, well managed, can support hundreds of internet service providers. But there is a problem. They are running in a way that the taxi drivers, which is the service provider, who are providing a service over a road for communicating. So I mean, the internet service providers are the same who are the owners and are managing the infrastructures. It's like having a taxi driver building the roads and then making the code for circulating to the roads. What's going to happen? That maybe that particular taxi driver will make a rule that is saying I'm having priority compared to any other taxi driver. So it's a conflict of interest in economics, but it's the way that it works and have been. So it's a mess, right? I mean, how the hell? I mean, if the taxi driver has the power to control the road, maybe will be no public transportation. That is very likely a result because of or no other companies will. You won't be able to use your own car for using the same road. At least they will give preference to himself. It's very. I mean, it's common. You don't have. I mean, I'm in a business school. I'm not trying to. But being as a simple citizen, that's the best. Who was designing it in that way? We have to. So yeah, it's actually what we do: make the infrastructure as in commons, a maintainer, something, and creating an ecosystem. Just applying common sense without going in further discussions. The problem is that when you build something in commons and you have many companies and because that enables local economy, circular, everybody. What is needed to manage a fiber? An electrician who installs a cable and then maintains a cable, and then someone else by the way, it doesn't have to be the same electrician providing the service and accessing Netflix and internet, and that's it. It's not that magic. The problem is that when that infrastructure starts growing and so on, and we are connecting actually like 200,000 people in the rural, which is very teeny compared to the cities, but very significant compared in those not populated areas, because the population is very spread, right? And so it's quite, many people still don't know, because they just went to their local shop and they get connected, and maybe they are using the infrastructure as in commons. And what we see is that, okay, as long as it starts growing, it creates an economic interest, of course, and starts the conflict. That's the tragedy of the commons that have to be solved. And I saw Marco also mentioning Ostrom, and I very much, to me, was for an inspiration also, because she was designing the principles for running a commons. And that's, to finish that, is about creating a governance. I heard that word very much. For me, it was a discovery. I mean, maybe because of being in a business school, that's very obvious. And governance is about accounting. This is like this about, and rules. And being sure that they apply it, and having an authority that doesn't work in self-regulation, let's say. It's not like free markets and doing everything, because if everything is free in terms of is in beer, then we are gonna have a trouble. So yes or yes, for the survival of the commons, we need accounting to be sure that it is good practices apply it and avoid crazy things. If the market, you allow the market to be the taxi driver and as well the roading, making the roads. For sure, yes or yes, you will run into very likely problems. It's about doing participative tools, and so that. And just to finish, and that made me, and that's another, and because being in a business school, that was in 2019, and that was very surprising, because quite often you see people hearing about the duality or the dichotomy between the private market, liberalization, no interventions, that's like, you will solve everything. If opposite to the nationalization, state-owned, and so on. And I feel very stupid during that dichotomy, because where I am then, because it's neither one solution. And it was funny to see just 2 years ago, the economies recognizing that there are alternatives to this duality. And actually, it sounds stupid, because actually what we are applying is the business models that maybe were already invented centuries ago. When going to rural areas, it's very used to have goods as in commons. Typically, natural resources is what Elinor Alston was describing. So why not? It can be translated to telecoms. And honestly, I want just to say, I mean, we are trying to use the common sense, and then by using the common sense, very likely economy as in commons will have in place, because it clearly can solve things that cannot be solved by just the free markets and let's say the traditional practices that are happening right now in telecoms. And that's it. Sorry for being a bit longer, and thanks.
For sharing your experience. I think that we have time now for the open mic. I don't know if in the floor there's, I mean, here in the room there's someone that has raised a question. No, and the chat is not. Yeah, sorry. Then Joanne, we hear your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for the presentations. I have a question more direct to Ramon, even though, I mean, both can intervene. The one which is very pragmatic is, at what point did you start adopting the commons framework? Because you said that you started with common sense, but at some point you discover Ostrom framework, and it seems that you started applying. So my question is not about the time, but why did you decide to adopt it? And the second question, regards a connection between the two presentations. In the first presentation, it seems that open source, to some extent, starts interpenetrating or becoming the infrastructure for other type of softwares, private softwares, to be developed, which makes reality much more complex, and it opens the spaces for new evolutionary trajectories. And my question is, if I apply this idea to the context of GIFINet, it seems GIFINet started in rural areas. We know that it has gone to major cities, but still is not interpenetrating with the other models. So it's like, so where are the limits of a model like GIFINet, to the point that, let's assume, I know that there's a lot of spaces to grow, no? But beyond the rural areas, how can a model like the one that you are proposing coexist with the other models, no? Maybe it's a very broad question, but...
When I discovered, I'm not an economist. I come from the technology arena, and it was very naive. I think we did that in Commons, not because of reading Elinor Ostrom and knowing his, because it was natural. It was a natural choice. Let's do it together and so on. Then we realized that was the right way. But at some point we started to face problems. People, the theory was very nice, and then we realized that things have to be managed, governance have to be in place, and so on. And I remember being in a business school, but in Berkeley. I was sharing with the other audience, and like this, I'm having these troubles, these guys are trying to steal from us, and this is a very well-known story. And yeah, the answer was that, yeah, that's why we are hearing you, because we want to understand how did you scale to solve those problems, because that will happen everywhere and and we were, let's say, and then somebody told me, have you read Elinor Ostrom? And then I realized that, then, yeah, that's very inspiring. You can agree with her on some places and some not, but of course she's very inspiring and a very, deserved Nobel Prize. And regarding to the second question, which was, sorry. To
what extent can a model like the one from...
yeah, what is the limit? I think common sense has no limit. Actually, for my opinion is how long it's going to take that speculative scenario that is right now happening. People deploying several, that's overbuilding. It has no sense. What about the carbon print for having 5, 10 infrastructures? That's stupidity. Will be, at the end of the day, more expensive for everyone in terms of technologically and efficiency and everything. And also economics. It doesn't make sense. Lots of things that are happening right now. Right now at my home, there is only not one fiber that I deployed in 2009. Also another one deployed by Telefonica in 2014, paid by the European Commission through the public grants and so on. So there is lots of stupid things happening still. And how long that's going to take? Has no limits. The thing is that we have to develop the good practices and so on. And in the long term, I think that we will be the winners, like in the open source right now. And Balmer, we have to eat his own words, saying, what is that contaminate everything? What contaminating everything is this kind of practices. So the question is how long it's going to take in that, and the speculation for sure will at some time, because why, right now the companies are acquiring each other's so volatile in the market. But if there are 4 cables, 5 cables in Barcelona, we're having, and not to say, because the more funny thing is that also the municipality has another cables by having, and a single cable can do everything. So the other are plastic that will be useless. And at some point, if you will look to the carbon print, we have actually to disconnect the cables, because I'm just making the facades more dirty. It's a stupidity. And so things have to be reverted, and the thing is, no limits. The limit is, of course, that we have to have in place the governance to ensure that we can grow up in let's say, in a sane scenario and solve the speculation, all the problems that yes or yes because many people, liberals, are defending free markets and no regulations and so on. And the first thing that they are trying to do is to kill competition and become a monopoly. So come on, I mean, free market was about having multiple alternatives, not kill the others. And that's why some regulation have to be in place and so on. But I hopefully in the long term, not will be the winner. And the question is how long it's going to take to get back into the common sense.
Marco, would you like to add
Yes,
something?
I would comment in this way. First, also the free software emerged not as a commons. They didn't think, they didn't know the commons. They emerged pragmatically. They went, Stallman wanted to defend what he called the fundamental freedom of the user. So it was completely different, the trajectory. They ended up building the first digital common, the first inventing a new form of property in order to defend these freedoms. They ended up reinventing the commons in the digital era. So that's interesting to see that it was a pragmatic process that brought to the commons. And also I would share what Ramon was saying, that is, in a way, I think we suffer of lack of pragmatism in our approaches to policy. And one of the most important scholars of the digital commons, who is Yochai Benkler, for example, ended up, he theorized different things, probably he changed also his mind, but ended up not saying that the most important contribution that the commons gives today to our political thought is about enlarging our institutional and policy imaginary. This is what we need and what is, in a way, blocked by this, as Ramon would say, this kind of hegemonic fixation that, in a way, is blocking the capacity, especially of the Western countries, to think in a pragmatic way about different possible solutions. And this is also a reason that I think China, in a way, is going to be advantaged because they are pragmatic. They apply different solutions according to which is the most effective. And this freedom of choosing different solutions, I think, is an advantage that we still don't have learned to apply. And it's time now that we learn to do it, because we have evidences that there are more wars that we thought were possible.
So we are now out of time. So questions, I invite you to approach the speakers after the closing, because now we have to move to the takeaways. And I think that it will take a couple of minutes so we can change the stage and so on. But first, let's give an applause to our speakers tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you. We will be back in a couple of minutes.
talks, a lot of very different approaches. I hope we have contributed a bit to something Ali, one of our speakers, said earlier about the need to contribute to break the homogeneity and to have more heterogeneity, different perspectives, different points of view. I think we contributed a bit to that. And I want to really thank all the speakers. We wish we had more time. We wish we had all of you guys here to have continue our conversations during coffee breaks. It was a bit of a hybrid experiment that we tried. We're very happy that it worked quite well, at least from our point of view here sitting in the floor. So we want to thank all the team of people here at the SADE Forum that helped us with that. I invited now, just to do a bit of a wrap up, the three moderators who've done a great work in keeping the time in a very strict limits, maybe even too strict perhaps. Sometimes we were left with a desire to continue asking one more question, but it's probably better for also those following online. I invited them to tell us a couple of things, 2-3 things that they would take away from the panel that they moderated to help us wrap it up. So I don't know if we start in the order that we had. So Joan, you go first.
Okay, so thank you, Daniel. I'll do my best and I'll try to summarize well, let's say I will present the takeaway summary from the three first presenters, speakers. We had Panicos Georgalis, who presented research that has examined the effect of social movements on the structures of moral markets. And one interesting thing was how he was considering the organizational identity of the entrance into the market. And he made a recommendation, a suggestion of 4 components that have to be taken into account when studying research on the evolution of moral markets. He mentioned the idea of the contributions of social movement organizations, the organizational heterogeneity, the interdependencies and configuration of actors, and the changes over time. And our second speaker, Desiree Pacheco, put emphasis or made a call for more for a structural emphasis of social movement research. Basically, she emphasized the mutual shaping relationship between social movement and industry structure, and also in the last paper, she emphasized the importance of the lifestyle and cultural work for the social movement and entrepreneur. And Desiree, to some extent, advocated for a cross-fertilization, let me use this word, between the literature on social movement and entrepreneurship when she was talking about the idea of change being present in both. And finally, the third speaker, Simone Schiller-Merkens, well, let's say that she make a call for theorizing social science that not only focuses on the actual, let me use the word, but to focus on the virtual, so they say the space of possibilities, no? And the idea was that let's try to actualize the desirable futures by theorizing them, no? To me, and with all respect, because I'm more coming from the engineering side, it reminds me which is the work of artists or the work of engineers, which is about devising the future and designing solutions for that. No, I think this metaphor could be applied to the idea of theorization. No? And that's my summary takeaways from the first table.
Okay, so my 2 cents on our panel. First panelist was Ali Alson-Gumuzey on the how to combine grand challenges and institutional theory, how to theorize about well, the digital transformation applied to the business and society field. And here he recommended us to look at the subject, specific players in this interplay, social movements, practices, even values behind this transformation, looking at the novelty. So he was making an invitation to think what is specific about this transformation. that is taking place. Well, and he was inviting us to theorize this change through the new appearing forms of organizing, all to contribute to these authors that pop up several times right on the idea of alternatives and real utopias. Our friend Mikkel Fliverboom, he provided one of these instances about how to theorize the consequences or the impacts of digital change. And for instance, he made a nice move from transparency, which is one of the ordinary keywords in the digital sphere, to start discussing about the managing of visibility. And here he made a few reflections on datafication, social ordering, profiling, surveillance, as an invitation to explore how we are transforming the way to deal with this visibility, not that much transparency. Finally, Marina Micheli, well, contributed with a very interesting, I would say, framework, typology of alternative ways to capture data handling practices, from data sharing pools to data cooperatives to public data trust to personal data sovereignty. And the interesting element here was this reflection about the pros and cons, the limitations and potentials behind of each of these different models.
And in the third panel, we got practical and pragmatic. We started the sessions, so the afternoon, talking about moral markets and social movements, and then about digitization and data. And in the end, we have been talking about software and hardware. And in the panel, we counted with Marco Berlinger, who offered an overview about the free open software movement. He has depicted 3 different stages, but I just mention the third one, which is the hopeful one, that it will come according to his terms in this decade, in the 20s, and it's about the advance of free open software and public policy innovation. And he has connected this with mixed forms of governance, which include also public cooperation, for instance. And then he has also mentioned the need to orchestrate multi-level forms of cooperation in this sense. And he has also mentioned the Chinese case, and this has this has been like an interesting example that you have brought, because it's another way to disrupt the market. So to some extent, using open software to break the rules of the winner takes it all economy that it's conquering the world at the moment. And from this software perspective, we have moved to the hardware by an activist, which is Ramon Roca, and he has shared his experience with Gifinet and their experience on providing infrastructure to rural areas under the concept that internet connection is it's a human right. And he has even asked if it's acceptable that only 80% of the people is connected, and what happens with the rest, with the other 20%. And their experience from the pragmatic approach that he has been sharing, it's all about self-regulation, accounting, and participatory governance. And also he has invited us to think about the commons as an alternative to the paradox or the false dichotomy between nationalization and privatization. So I would say that both have been practical and pragmatic in their approaches, and that the common point between the two interventions is the need to develop multi-level governance tools, processes, and actions.
Many thanks for the 3 moderators for this summary. From my part, only to add that it was very nice to see how these calls at the beginning from some of the speakers to work more on these real utopias that are already there, that are glimpses of how the future or the desirable future could be. Made clear at the last panel with the study on open software and the study of Gifinet. And maybe Ramon wouldn't like the word real utopia or alternatives, but they would like the word things that make sense or that are common sense. But sometimes things that are common sense require a lot of collective effort to put together, and it requires a lot of people with activism to connect the dots and put all the actors to collaborate. So I hope everybody had something to take home to think about, and that you enjoyed the sessions. And many thanks for sticking with us, and I hope to see you soon in another occasion. Thank you.